Hello, and welcome to Echoes of the Forgotten Earth, a place where curiosity moves at an easy pace, and science unfolds slowly enough that your thoughts can wander alongside it. This evening, we're leaving behind the ticking seconds of our own clocks and drifting instead into an expanse of time so vast and uncanny that even the word ancient feels too fresh to fit. We're setting off toward the Mesozoic, an era when the planet wore a face we would hardly recognize. A time when life was reorganizing itself into forms that would later become the most iconic figures of prehistory. Dinosaurs were only a single strand in that tapestry, even if they tend to claim most of the attention. There were seas crowded with reptilian predators, skies crossed by wings unlike any bird we see today, forests that would feel like stepping into an alien world, and climates that sculpted the rise and collapse of whole ecosystems long before humans appeared to wonder what it was like. Before we truly begin, it's worth asking where you are as you listen. Is night settling in around you, the world outside dimming into quiet? Or is the sun just climbing, and the day beginning to unfurl its first possibilities? It's a strange thought, isn't it? That we sit here in our own small slice of the present while we try to imagine a moment that lies hundreds of millions of years behind us. If this unhurried journey feels calming to you, you might choose to click, like, or subscribe if you'd enjoy joining more of these gentle explorations. It helps other people find their way to this small corner of Earth where science is less about sprinting toward answers and more about slowly turning over the wonders we almost let slip from memory. So let's take that step together, not with haste, but with something like the patience that Earth itself seems to hold. Because to really picture the Mesozoic, the first thing we need to do is loosen our grip on what we know now. Close your eyes if you like, and try to summon the world not as it is, but as it once was. There were no continents sitting in the familiar pattern you see on maps. North America, South America, Africa, Europe, Asia, none of them occupied the positions your mind expects. Instead, they were fused into a single vast landmass we call Pangaea, at least at the outset. This supercontinent stretched across much of the globe in one unbroken sweep of land. The surrounding oceans were broad in a way that's hard for us to imagine. The very air carried a different scent. Plants exhaled chemicals into a sky with a very different mix of oxygen and carbon dioxide from what you're breathing now. Volcanoes flared more frequently in many regions, their constant eruptions shaping the atmosphere, while unfamiliar coniferous forests crept over landscapes where mammals, still tiny, quiet, and secretive, scurried and hid in the shadows. If you could stand there, you might not even recognize the soundscape. No bird songs like those you know. No humming of bees, because flowers had not yet staged their grand arrival. Instead, you would hear the calls of early reptiles, the thunder of waves on shorelines with unfamiliar outlines, and the dry rustling of cycads in the wind. This was a world in recovery. Just before the Mesozoic opened, Earth had passed through one of its darkest chapters. A mass extinction so intense, it almost erased complex life altogether. That catastrophe at the end of the Permian period may have eliminated something like 90% of ocean species and a huge share of those on land. The planet was left nearly emptied. The Mesozoic became the long, patient reconstruction that followed. When you keep that in mind, the entire era takes on a different tone. It wasn't merely a random sequence of bizarre creatures. It was life cautiously experimenting again after disaster testing new forms, filling abandoned roles, and exploring possibilities that had never before been attempted. Picture a horizon stretching across the deserts of Pangaea. You would see immense rust-colored landscapes baked under an intense sun, broken only by rivers that carried life in narrow, winding ribbons across otherwise barren expanses. The air would waver with heat. The vegetation, mostly hardy and drought-resistant, would stand scattered and solitary like distant sentinels. But if you followed those rivers, you'd come upon fertile corridors where amphibians prospered, where small reptiles flashed in and out of cover, and where the ancestors of the great dinosaurs were only beginning to stir. The world was wide open. Ecological roles had been left vacant by extinction, and evolution moved in to occupy them. Calling the Mesozoic a single thing, though, is a little misleading. It spans an almost incomprehensible length of time, from roughly 252 million years ago to about 66 million years ago. That's close to 186 million years of change. Continents drifting, climates shifting, species appearing, thriving, and vanishing. To give that some context, the full stretch of recorded human history amounts to only a few thousand years. Our entire species has existed for maybe 300,000 years. The Mesozoic extends across hundreds of millions. It's a timescale so broad that entire mountain ranges could rise and crumble away completely within it. To move through this age is not to stand still, but to ride a ceaseless tide of change. Yet when people hear the word Mesozoic, their thoughts usually leap straight to dinosaurs, and understandably so. This era was their stage. But if we focus only on them, we risk losing sight of the full scale of what Earth was like. The Mesozoic was not merely an age of dinosaurs. It was also the age of newborn oceans, of continental plates grinding apart and reshaping everything. It was a time of evolutionary experiments in the skies and seas, of climates swinging between intense greenhouse warmth and cooler intervals, of plant lineages quietly remaking the surface of the planet long before mammal-dominated forests like those we know today appeared. Try for a moment to imagine the sky. Today we take for granted the sight of birds wheeling overhead. Back then, the earliest birds were only just emerging, their feathers more primitive, their flight somewhat clumsier. For most of that era, the true masters of the air were the pterosaurs reptiles, with wings stretched across elongated fingers. Some were no larger than sparrows, others approached the size of small aircraft. They would have spiraled above shorelines, plunging down for fish or scavenging along beaches, their shadows sliding across dunes below. Now turn your attention to the oceans. You'd see waters alive with reptiles that had abandoned the land altogether. Sleek ichthyosaurs, with bodies shaped much like dolphins, surged after shoals of fish. Long-necked plesiosaurs glided through the water like living legends, their small heads flicking above the waves. Later still, great mosasaurs took over immense lizards adapted fully to marine life, armed with jaws that could swallow large prey in a single bite. Even the seas themselves were different. Reefs weren't built just by corals, but also by odd sponges and peculiar bivalves. Along shorelines lay shells in forms you've never seen, and out in the open water, legions of ammonites, spiral-shelled relatives of squid floated by the millions. On land, forests pressed thick and deep with conifers, cycads, and ginkgos. Envision tree trunks rising like columns, their crowns spreading wide and dark overhead. The forest floor would be strewn with unfamiliar ferns and horsetails towering above your head. It was a verdant world, but not like the flowering woodlands you know. Flowers wouldn't truly take hold until late in the era, so the landscapes lacked many of the colors and fragrances we consider natural today. Instead, the palette was dominated by greens and browns and grays, punctuated by cones and naked seeds of gymnosperms. Into this world, dinosaurs emerged. At first, they were small and easy to overlook, just one more set of reptiles competing for survival. Gradually, they began to spread, adapting into new forms. Some walked upright on two legs, others moved on four, and some could shift between the two. Over vast spans of time, certain lineages grew into the colossal sauropods' bodies stretching longer than buses, heavier than any land animal that existed before or has appeared since. With them came predators of every scale, from nimble hunters not much larger than a person, to apex giants like Allosaurus and, later, the formidable Tyrannosaurus. Yet the Mesozoic wasn't only a story of giants. It was also an era of subtler lives, the first mammals nosing through the undergrowth, insects adjusting to unfamiliar plants, and ecosystems weaving themselves into increasing complexity. Every shift in climate or geography redrew the map of survival. As Pangaea broke apart into smaller continents, isolation encouraged diversity. Dinosaurs on one landmass evolved differently from their distant relatives on another. Life branched outward, spreading and specializing, filling the world in patterns that still echo in today's biodiversity. Even in quiet corners, the Mesozoic left its signature. Rivers carried sediments that hardened into rock, where fossils now rest. Volcanoes sprinkled layers of ash that mark turning points in time. Every bed of stone from that era forms a page in a story we're only beginning to interpret. When a paleontologist brushes dust from a fossilized bone, they're not only holding a fragment of a long dead organism, but also a tiny piece of the world it inhabited, evidence of how Earth looked, smelled, and sounded in that remote age. And here we stand, at the threshold of this immense sweep of history, ready to wander through it slowly. The Mesozoic Earth was not a single landscape, but an entire theater of transformation. An age when life experimented wildly, and the planet itself rewrote its own rules. From deserts to wetlands, from mountain chains to shallow inland seas, from the tentative first steps of dinosaurs to the ground, shaking thunder of their dominance. It was a world both alien and strangely foundational. Foreign to us, yet essential to everything that followed. As we drift farther in, we'll follow these stories piece by piece. The rise of dinosaurs, the sway of ancient forests, the restlessness of the oceans, the crowded skies, the shifting climates, the slow arrival of flowers, and the final catastrophe that brought it all to a close. Because to ask what Earth was like during the Mesozoic is not to ask for a single snapshot. It's to open a long, winding path, a journey stretching across nearly 200 million years of Earth's own imagination. When people conjure up the age of dinosaurs, their thoughts usually leap straight to the colossal figures. Sauropods towering high enough to cast shadows over entire valleys, armored creatures clanking through woodlands, carnivores with jaws strong enough to crush bone in a heartbeat. But in reality, for most of their long tenure, dinosaurs weren't solitary rulers marching across empty ground. They lived among an abundance of neighbors in every shape and size, sharing ecosystems as busy and intricate as any modern rainforest or savanna. To grasp what Earth felt like then, you have to look beyond the famous animals and consider the whole stage they shared. Imagine yourself in a valley in the Jurassic period, the air heavy with the sticky scent of conifer resin and the damp, musty smell of ferns underfoot. To your left, a line of sauropods drifts past, moving slowly as their long necks sway far above the canopy, stripping foliage from branches. Closer to the ground, smaller forms flicker between trunks. Tiny mammals, no larger than mice, dart through the leaf litter in the hours of darkness, their sharp noses combing for insects. Early lizards cling to warm rocks, watching warily for anything that might swoop or pounce. Yes, dinosaurs are there, but they're only one part of a continuous negotiation of survival. Out on broad flats, herds of plant-eating dinosaurs congregate much like wildebeest on modern plains. Their heavy footfalls shake the soil, leaving deep tracks that will turn to stone and be studied millions of years later. Yet they don't own the land outright. Crocodile-like reptiles wade in rivers and lakes, lying almost invisible until some thirsty creature leans a little too far toward the water. Above, pterosaurs ride rising columns of air, eyes sharp as they search for fish, carcasses, or a small, unwary animal to snatch. And below it all, the soil itself crawls with insects, burrowing, feeding, breaking down dead plant material, and returning it to the earth. Their hidden work keeps the cycle of life moving in ways that seldom draw attention, but matter profoundly. The Mesozoic wasn't a neat tale in which one group rose while all others faded into the background. It was a crowded stage. For a long stretch of time, dinosaurs weren't even the obvious headliners. In the early Triassic, in the wake of the Great Extinction, other reptiles held the advantage. The ancestors of crocodile pseudosuchians thrived in an array of forms. Some were heavily armored like living tanks, Others walked upright on two legs, occupying niches dinosaurs wouldn't claim until much later. There were strange archosaurs with beaked faces, plated backs, and features that, in hindsight, look like prototypes from an evolutionary workshop full of experimental designs. It's important to see that early world as uncertain. Earth was in recovery mode, with ecosystems reconstructing themselves from fragments. Dinosaurs at that stage were small, lightly built, and unimpressive beside the bulkier reptiles around them. They persisted in the background, enduring quietly until shifts in climate and environment tilted the balance in their favor. Even after that turning point, they were never alone. Crocodile relatives continued alongside them. Amphibians clung to the watery margins of the landscape. Mammals moved in darkness and in hidden corners. In the nearby seas, ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs ruled the waves without serious competition. What makes this era so absorbing is just how interwoven everything was. When we talk about dinosaurs now, it's easy to treat them as isolated marvels towering curiosities posed on museum floors. But in their time, they were simply one set of actors in the broader food web. The great herbivores that browsed on conifers opened gaps in the forest canopy, letting sunlight reach down to the ground where ferns and smaller plants could thrive. Predators that hunted those giants left carcasses behind for scavengers to clean up. Insects carried pollen and began, slowly, to spread the first flowering plants as the Cretaceous progressed. Every action sent out ripples. The neighbors of dinosaurs weren't minor details. They were crucial in shaping the very surroundings that made dinosaur success possible. Now, picture a wetland in the late Cretaceous. Herds of hadrosaurs gather along the water's edge, their duck-billed faces dipping as they crop vegetation. Their calls roll across the marsh low, resonant sounds that might be warnings, reassurances between parents and young, or simply the murmur of social conversation. Between their legs, mammals are busy. Some dig and vanish into burrows, popping in and out. Others climb through scrubby shrubs, gripping stems with small hands as they search for seeds or insects. Crocodiles slip silently from banks into the murky water, only their eyes visible above the surface. Overhead, pterosaurs with wingspans longer than a car patrol the sky. It is not an empty domain, but a layered, crowded world where each niche is occupied. Even plants played the role of neighbors. Early in the Mesozoic, landscapes were dominated by gymnosperm cycads, conifers, and ginkgos. These trees and shrubs built the framework of forests, but they didn't provide the same sorts of resources we associate with modern habitats. There were no blossoms to lure bees, no sweet fruits hanging to tempt mammals or birds. Yet life adapted. Insects adjusted to nibble gymnosperm tissues. Reptiles fed on cycads. Dinosaurs browsed at heights no other animals could reach. When flowering plants finally appeared in the Cretaceous, the entire tempo of life shifted. Flowers drew in pollinators, seeds became food for new lineages. The diversity of neighbors expanded quickly on evolutionary timescales. When you picture this web of neighbors, the Mesozoic begins to feel less like some distant, exotic realm, and more like an early version of the world we know. It's easy to imagine a dinosaur stomping through a vacant forest, but reality was nothing like that. Just as no animal today exists in isolation, every creature then shared its world with others, vying for food, reshaping its surroundings, and reacting to countless unseen interactions. Dinosaurs had neighbors at every step. Some were competitors, some were prey, some were predators, some were allies in a sense. Pollinators, decomposers, partners in complex webs of cause and effect. All were part of the same unfolding narrative. The seas, too, remind us of this balance. While land provided the main stage for dinosaurs, the oceans hosted a separate drama. Marine reptiles ruled there. Ammonites with intricate spiral shells drifted in vast numbers, destined to be prey for larger hunters. Schools of fish swarmed together in dense clouds. Sea urchins and crustaceans crawled over the sea floor. It was a world as varied and tumultuous as any coral reef today. And though dinosaurs never entered those waters, their fates were tied to them. Ocean currents helped steer climate. Shifting shorelines opened and closed coastal habitats. Rising and falling sea levels dictated where land animals could live. Even the insects deserved their place in this picture. They were constant companions to dinosaurs, whirring through the air, tunneling underground, feeding on plants, and sometimes on each other. Giant dragonflies the size of hawks no longer soared as they had in earlier times. But beetles, flies, and the early kin of butterflies flourished. They pollinated, decomposed, and occasionally annoyed. Always present, always shaping how life worked. Dinosaurs moved through a soundscape where the soft drone of insects might have been as steady as the wind. And then there were the mammals. Too often, they're dismissed as insignificant background figures waiting patiently for dinosaurs to disappear. In truth, they were lively, inventive neighbors. They tried out climbing, digging, gliding. They refined their senses for use in darkness, flourishing in hours when the great reptiles slept. Some chased insects, others nibbled plants. Still others likely took advantage of whatever food they could find. Their small size kept them out of the spotlight, but their adaptability meant that when the Mesozoic finally ended in disaster, they were ready to move into the space that extinction left behind. Step back and look at the entire scene, and you realize that the age of dinosaurs was less about a single ruling clan and more about an earth thick with life. Every creature was linked to others. Every habitat contained many layers of relationships. Dinosaurs may be the ones we notice most now, but their neighbors reveal just as much about what that world really was. A world of sharing and conflict, of side-by-side adaptation, of endless entanglement. The more you linger in that image, the more it resembles our own world. We too live among countless neighbors, many of them invisible or overlooked. From the insects quietly renewing the soil under our feet, to the birds that still fill our skies, our lives are woven into a tapestry of connections. The dinosaurs moved through a world braided from many threads. In a great many ways, so do we. If you were to stretch Earth's history out along a single ribbon of time, the Mesozoic would occupy an immense middle span, long enough that entire human civilizations could rise and fall 1,000 times over and still not make a noticeable mark on it. When people call it the Age of Reptiles, they aren't exaggerating, though it was far more than dinosaurs alone. Reptiles in a stunning variety of forms dominated land, sea, and sky, adapting into roles that persisted for tens of millions upon tens of millions of years. To understand why it deserves that name, you need to sit with just how long it lasted, and how much change can unfold within such a vast stretch of time. The story begins after the Earth had staggered through its greatest dying. The Permian extinction had swept the board nearly clean. From those empty spaces emerged opportunity. In the early Triassic, reptiles of many kinds began to fan out into the newly opened niches. Some stayed small and close to the ground. Others became heavy, armor-plated herbivores. Still others experimented with walking upright on their hind legs, setting the stage for what would later become dinosaurs. But for those first tens of millions of years, no single group truly dominated. It was a period of reshuffling, of ecosystems slowly knitting themselves back together from ruins. Each new body plan, each new lifestyle, was a trial run in the ongoing test of survival. As the Triassic wore on, some lineages emerged as clear success stories. Among them were the ancestors of crocodiles' robust, diverse animals, many of them walking tall on long legs, occupying roles from fast-moving predators to heavily armored plant eaters. Alongside them, early dinosaurs were still modest, small, swift, and far from the ruling giants they would later become. If you had stood on the bank of a Triassic river, you might have been more impressed by the imposing crocodile cousins and strange armored reptiles than by the quick, two-legged creatures we now revere as dinosaurs. But the planet never stays the same for long. Shifts in climate, changing geography, and repeated extinction events kept tipping the balance. Toward the end of the Triassic, another wave of extinction swept away many of the dominant reptile groups, including a great many crocodile relatives. That cleared the stage for dinosaurs to move forward. Move forward they did, expanding in size and shape and in their ecological roles until they grew into the thundering figures that, in our imagination, now define the Mesozoic. From that point on, Reptiles of all kinds held sway across the world. On land, dinosaurs were the leading actors, and their diversity becomes breathtaking when you take the full length of their reign into account. On one continent, long-necked sauropods stretched toward the highest branches. On another, horned and frilled dinosaurs grazed on open plains. Swift, sickle-clawed raptors dashed through forests, while enormous predators lurked in shadowed clearings. But they were never alone. In the seas, marine reptiles grew sleek and powerful, taking over the top of the food chain from large fish and sharks. Above, pterosaurs unfurled membranous wings and claimed the skies long before birds truly came into their own. It can be dizzying to contemplate how long these patterns held. Consider how recent human history is. About 10,000 years since we began building cities. Perhaps 300,000 years since the earliest Homo sapiens. The Mesozoic spans nearly 200 million years. Entire groups of dinosaurs appeared, flourished, and disappeared without ever coming close to the time when humans would arrive. The reign of sauropods alone lasted tens of millions of years longer than mammals, as a group, have yet enjoyed their present dominance. To Earth, dinosaurs weren't a passing curiosity. They were the long-term residents, the standard around which entire ecosystems organize themselves. And yet, to call it simply the Age of Reptiles is not to forget the quieter companions that never left the stage. Mammals were there, small, persistent, running their own parallel story. Amphibians held on in shrinking wetlands, diminished but not gone. Insects buzzed continuously, evolving new shapes as plants diversified. Still, it was reptiles in all their variety that set the tone. Their bodies became the architecture of ecosystems. Their presence shaped forests, plains, rivers, and coastlines through sheer numbers and size. Think about the oceans. For most of the Mesozoic, reptiles ruled them in a way fish never had. Ichthyosaurs shot through the water like living torpedoes, some species growing as long as buses. Plesiosaurs, with snake-like necks, wove through schools of fish, their flippers paddling with surprising grace despite their bulky frames. Later, Mosasaurs' enormous marine lizards surged into prominence, driving through clouds of prey with jaws lined in backward curving teeth that prevented any escape once they closed. These weren't side notes. For millions upon millions of years, if you were to imagine the ocean's apex predators, you wouldn't think of sharks or orcas. You'd picture reptiles. In the skies, pterosaurs rose with a grace that's easy to underestimate when you only see their skeletons in a museum case. Some species eventually reached wingspans of over 10 meters, making them among the largest flying animals ever. Certain kinds soared like modern seabirds, riding air currents over coastlines for great distances. Others were small, fluttering, and maneuvering like bats as they hunted insects. They filled niches ranging from tiny aerial hunters to enormous sky dominators, and they held those roles for more than 150 million years. Birds may rule the air today, but pterosaurs held that crown far longer than birds have so far managed. On land, the sheer variety of dinosaur forms is what makes Age of Reptiles such a fitting label. Armored stegosaurs, bristling with plates and spikes, duck-billed hadrosaurs, many with intricate crests, predators like Spinosaurus, which may have straddled the boundary between land and water. Evolution's creativity during this era appears almost inexhaustible. These weren't just oversized lizards stomping through forests. They were specialists, adapted to climates ranging from parched deserts to humid swamps, thriving on continents that were themselves splitting and drifting apart, creating fresh opportunities for isolation and diversification. One way to appreciate the duration of this age is to remember that Earth itself transformed beneath the feet of its reptilian inhabitants. At the beginning of the Mesozoic, all the continents were welded together into Pangaea. By the end, they had begun to resemble the configuration we recognize on a modern map. Dinosaurs didn't just endure this change, they adapted to it. As land masses broke apart, populations found themselves isolated and over time, evolved into distinct species. That's why we see such different dinosaur lineages in South America compared to Asia, or North America compared to Africa. The fragmentation of the supercontinent generated new environments, and reptiles of all kinds responded accordingly. Climate, too, shifted dramatically. In the early Triassic, the world was hot and dry, with deserts covering vast interior regions. During the Jurassic, conditions became more humid. Forests spread widely across the globe. By the Cretaceous, greenhouse conditions were pronounced. Sea levels rose, flooding continents with shallow, warm seas and creating lush, warm environments. Throughout all of this, reptiles adjusted, expanded, and flourished. It's difficult to think of another major animal group so versatile, so capable of bending itself to nearly every challenge the planet posed. You might be tempted to ask why reptiles, specifically, managed to dominate in this way. The answer is complicated. Part of it is timing. They survived key extinctions that wiped out many rivals. Part of it is their biology. The ability to thrive in a range of climates, to lay eggs on land, and to evolve into a staggering variety of body sizes and shapes. Part of it is simply the logic of evolution. Small advantages, compounded over immense timescales, can reshape the entire structure of life. Once reptiles gained a foothold after the Permian extinction, their momentum carried them through era after era. Perhaps the most striking thing, however, is that for all their dominance, they were never static. The Mesozoic wasn't a single frozen moment of reptilian rule. It was a continual dance of rise and fall. Stegosaurs flourished in the Jurassic and then declined, giving way to horned ceratopsians in the Cretaceous. Small, nimble predators in one epoch were replaced by towering tyrannosaurs in another. Each wave left fossils behind like bookmarks in the rock, reminders that even during stretches of apparent stability, change was always at work. When paleontologists refer to this as the age of reptiles, they're condensing nearly 200 million years of dominance by creatures that filled almost every ecological slot the planet could offer. It's a reminder of how long Earth has been shaped by life forms and forces far beyond human experience. And it sets the stage for everything that followed. Without that enormous span, without reptiles weaving themselves into every corner of land, sea, and sky, the world we recognize today would be fundamentally different. If the land during the Mesozoic throbbed with footfalls, calls, and the susurration of plant life, the seas were no less alive, though their voices traveled differently. Beneath the waves, life continued its experiments, shaping bodies and behaviors that might seem fantastical to us, but were ordinary in their own time. To imagine these ancient oceans is to conjure a realm at once alien and oddly familiar, full of predators and prey, migrations and cycles. The same relentless push and pull that defines modern marine ecosystems. The phrase, ancient seas, might suggest slow, quiet waters. In truth, they were anything but quiet. They were in constant motion, crisscrossed by creatures that claimed their own kind of supremacy long before mammals ever ventured inland from the shores. At the very beginning of the Mesozoic, after the devastation of the Permian extinction, the oceans were nearly emptied. Reefs had collapsed. Many shellfish and fish lineages had been erased. Even the chemistry of the water was unstable for long stretches. But as the Triassic dawned, the seas gradually rebuilt themselves. New kinds of corals returned. Sponges colonized rocky surfaces. Mollusks diversified again. Schools of fish recovered, darting in coordinated patterns that soon attracted predators. Into this newly open space, reptiles slipped in, not as occasional visitors but as residents. Among the earliest of these marine reptiles were the ichthyosaurs. Their ancestors probably began as land-dwelling reptiles that slowly adapted to coastal hunting, venturing into shallow bays and eventually diving deeper and staying longer until they cut their ties to land entirely. Within a relatively short geological time, ichthyosaurs evolved into streamlined forms so reminiscent of dolphins that, at a distance, you might mistake them for modern mammals. They had long jaws lined with sharp teeth, huge eyes tuned to dim underwater light, and tails that drove them forward with startling speed. They prospered through the Triassic, and well into the Jurassic, some species grew to the length of buses, becoming true giants of the sea. But ichthyosaurs were not alone. Around the same time, another reptile lineage took to the water and eventually gave rise to the plesiosaurs. Unlike the sleek, fish-like ichthyosaurs, plesiosaurs developed broad bodies and 4 strong flippers. They came in 2 main body plans. Long-necked plesiosaurs had small heads on extremely extended necks, ideal for flicking after fish or squid. Short-necked pliosaurs had larger heads, packed with powerful jaws suited for tackling sizable prey. All of them flew through the water using their flippers, moving in a way that resembled underwater flight, similar to the motion of modern sea turtles. They became some of the most recognizable marine reptiles of the Mesozoic, their silhouettes instantly familiar from fossils and reconstructions. Of course, the ocean's life was not limited to reptiles. Ammonites, distant relatives of modern squid and octopuses, floated in huge numbers. Their coiled shells ranged from tiny spirals that could nestle in your palm to massive coils nearly a meter across. They were hunters of smaller creatures and prey for larger animals. Their hard, abundant shells are among the most common fossils from the era, recording not just their presence but the rise and fall of entire marine communities. Their cousins, the belemnites, looked more like streamlined squid, adapted for fast swimming in open water. Together, ammonites and belemnites filled the seas, their populations waxing and waning in step with the fortunes of reptiles and fish around them. Reef ecosystems gradually re-established themselves as well. Instead of being built solely by the corals we know today, many Mesozoic reefs were constructed by rudest clams, strange bivalves that grew into column-like forms and towers, forming complex underwater landscapes. These reefs provided shelter and feeding grounds for countless fish, crustaceans, and invertebrates, much as modern reefs do, becoming hotspots of biodiversity that drew predators from far and wide. Imagine swimming through one of these ancient reef systems. The shapes would be unfamiliar, the architecture odd to your eye, but the impression would be the same. Walls and crevices alive with motion, schools of fish flickering in and out of hiding places, predators circling on the edges, waiting for some inattentive animal to stray too far. As the Jurassic transitioned into the Cretaceous, the seas grew even more dynamic. Global temperatures were warm, sea levels were high, shallow epicontinental seas spread over large sections of the continents. North America, for example, was split by the Western Interior Seaway, a broad, shallow ocean stretching from what is now the Arctic down to the Gulf of Mexico. These inland seas became highways for marine reptiles, rich hunting grounds for fish and ammonites, and safe nesting zones for early seabirds. They linked ecosystems across wide regions, giving species space to spread and diversify. In these waters, a new reptile stepped into dominance: the mosasaurs. Descended from land-dwelling lizards, mosasaurs adapted very quickly to marine life. They grew massive. Some species surpassed 15 meters in length, with jaws that opened wide enough to swallow large prey whole. Their bodies were muscular and flexible, their tails powerful. They were among the swiftest and most formidable hunters in marine history. In many ways, they filled the roles now held by orcas and great white sharks' apex predators with few true rivals. Fossils even show remains of other mosasaurs inside their stomachs, proof that they preyed on each other as readily as on fish and ammonites. The Mesozoic oceans also nurtured many fish lineages that still influence the seas today. Early teleosts, the ancestors of most modern fish, began to diversify in the Jurassic and especially in the Cretaceous. Their adaptability gave them an edge, allowing them to explore new feeding strategies and habitats. Sharks persisted throughout this era, even if they were often overshadowed by the larger reptiles. They hunted, scavenged, and waited at the edges of reef systems. Their cartilaginous skeletons don't fossilize as easily as bone, but their teeth remain, scattered through sediments as a durable record of their presence. Even the smallest organisms played essential roles. Plankton, microscopic plants, and animals drifting in the sunlit layers of the ocean form the base of marine food webs just as they do now. Their population booms and crashes influenced the abundance of fish, which in turn shaped the fortunes of the reptiles that fed on them. Tiny plankton shells settled slowly onto the seafloor, accumulating over millions of years into thick chalk deposits. The famous White Cliffs of Dover, for example, are built from the remains of countless plankton that lived and died in Cretaceous seas, a lasting monument to the productivity of ancient oceans. What stands out, once you gather all this in, is the tremendous energy of those seas. They were not empty backdrops to the drama on land, but vibrant stages of their own, with rivalries, strategies, and balances that persisted far longer than any human civilization. A silver flash of fish might suddenly explode apart under the attack of an ichthyosaur. A plesiosaur might surface, scanning for danger or opportunity. A mosasaur might erupt from below, jaws snapping shut around its quarry before vanishing again into depth and shadow. Every tide, every migration, every feeding event formed part of a rhythm that defined life in the Mesozoic just as firmly as dinosaurs did on land. Those oceans didn't just move within their own basins. Their rise and fall influenced the entire planet. Sea level changes reshaped coastlines, shifted climates, and created or erased habitats. Shallow, warm seas heated the air above them, making nearby lands lush and humid. When they retreated, climates dried, deserts expanded, and ecosystems had to adjust or disappear. The motion of the oceans was written not only in waves, but in the contours of continents and the patterns of rain and temperature. The creatures of those ancient seas left more than skeletons in rock. They left echoes in today's fauna. Modern whales with streamlined bodies and sophisticated hunting strategies recall the ichthyosaurs in both form and role. Sea turtles paddling steadily through open water echo plesiosaurs in their flipper-driven flight. Monitor lizards with their muscular builds and strong jaws are close kin to the mosasaurs that once ruled the seas. Even many fish and sharks of our time descend from lineages that swam beneath the shadows of marine reptiles. To study those long-gone oceans is to study the roots of the seas we know now. Seas shaped across millions of years under reptilian dominance. And when you think of Earth as a whole during that age, the oceans remind you that it was never solely about dinosaurs or about life on land. The seas were equal partners in the story, always shifting, hosting empires of their own that rose and fell with the tides and with global change. They were hidden from the view of land animals, but not any less important, not any less vibrant, not any less driven by the same relentless urge to live, to eat, to reproduce, and to adapt. When people think of the Mesozoic, they often picture dinosaurs moving across bare ground, isolated against open horizons. But in truth, they lived inside forests, swamps, and open spaces woven together by the plants that gave their world structure. Those plants were not the ones you recognize from today. The flowers, fruits, and grasses that feel so ordinary to us were either absent or only just beginning to appear. Instead, the Earth's greenery was built from conifers, cycads, ginkgos, ferns, and horsetails, a kind of vegetation that shaped the planet's character for nearly 200 million years. To imagine dinosaurs accurately, you have to place them inside these forests of giants. If you walked into a Triassic forest, the first difference you might notice would be the air. Oxygen levels rose and fell over the course of the Mesozoic, sometimes higher than today, sometimes lower. Volcanic outgassing and plant growth pushed the atmosphere's chemistry into different balances of oxygen and carbon dioxide. The smell would not be the gentle sweetness of flowers. Blossoms had not yet become part of the scenery. Instead, the air would be saturated with the sharp, resinous scent of conifers and the damp, earthy aroma of ferns. Underfoot, you would find cones and needles rather than petals. Colors would be muted, a world of deep greens and browns, occasionally punctuated by the shapes of seed cones or the pale undersides of leaves. But without the explosion of floral hues, we now consider normal. Conifers were among the dominant trees. Kin to modern pines, firs, and redwoods, they formed the backbone of many forests. Some individuals reached enormous size, their trunks as wide as small houses and their crowns spreading in thick canopies that shaded entire ecosystems beneath. These trees provided shelter to a multitude of organisms, from insects burrowing beneath bark to reptiles climbing along branches. They also fed the giants, Sauropods with their long necks reaching upward browsed among conifer branches, stripping needles and twigs in great sweeping bites. The relationship between those towering plants and the towering animals that fed on them was intimate and continuous, each shaping the other over many generations. Cycads were another defining feature of the landscape. To modern eyes, they resemble palms, but they are unrelated. With stout trunks and crowns of stiff, leathery leaves, cycads were ancient even then, with roots extending deep into older geological ages. During the Mesozoic, they flourished. In some areas, entire stands of cycads stretched across lowlands, their leaf clusters catching sunlight while their thick seeds provided food for animals capable of cracking them open. Imagine a broad plain dotted with cycads like clusters of green fountains frozen in mid-spray, and across that plain, herds of dinosaurs moving slowly as they graze. Then there were the ginkgos. Today only a single living species remains, commonly planted in parks and cities as an ornamental tree. In the Mesozoic, they were far more diverse. Their distinctive fan-shaped leaves spread across forests of the northern hemisphere. Their branches formed a canopy of instantly recognizable silhouettes, even to us. Their large, fleshy seeds likely provided food for reptiles and early mammals alike. Their remarkable resilience is one reason a ginkgo species endures nearly unchanged after more than 200 million years, a living link between our world and theirs. Ferns, horsetails, and seed ferns carpeted and filled the understory. Ferns thrived in moist environments, forming dense mats along the forest floor and draping up the trunks of larger trees. Horsetails, with their segmented stems, grew in thick stands along riverbanks and wetlands, some reaching heights that would tower over a human. These plants had already survived for ages before the Mesozoic began, yet they adapted to its new conditions and continued to provide the green backdrop against which herbivores of every size fed. For most of the Mesozoic, these were the plants that defined life on land. They created shade, shelter, oxygen, and food. They were the scaffolding of ecosystems. Without them, the dinosaurs we think of as colossal could never have grown so large. Sauropods could attain their immense size only because enough plant matter existed to sustain them. Hadrosaurs could graze in numbers because cycads and conifers provided continual supplies of foliage. Even carnivores depended indirectly on this botanical wealth. Their prey drew its strength from these forests and groves. Then, late in the story, something truly new appeared. Flowering plants. Angiosperms entered the scene in the Cretaceous. At first they were small and rare, no urgent threat to the established forests of conifers and cycads. But they carried advantages that soon changed everything. Flowers allowed a more targeted strategy of reproduction. Rather than relying solely on wind to scatter pollen, flowering plants attracted animals, especially insects, to carry pollen directly between blooms. That made them more efficient and adaptable. They also developed fruits, fleshy, appealing packages surrounding seeds. Animals ate the fruits and dispersed the seeds far from the parent plant. In evolutionary terms, this turned the entire animal world into a transport network. Within tens of millions of years, flowering plants had spread widely across the globe, reshaping landscapes in ways that still define our world. Their arrival also changed the insect world. Bees had not yet fully evolved, but other pollinators began to exploit the new opportunities flowers offered. Pollinators and plants co-evolved, shaping one another's forms and behaviors. New ecological relationships formed, new food webs branched outward. Suddenly, the green world gained real splashes of color yellows, reds, purples colors that weren't just incidental, but signals to eyes that could see them. The subtle scents of resin and damp soil were joined by floral fragrances designed to attract. Dinosaurs themselves may have noticed these changes, feeding on early fruits and seeds or carrying pollen unknowingly on their skins as they brushed past blooming plants. Forests in the late Cretaceous were no longer the same as those of the Triassic. They were richer, more layered, more tightly interlinked. One striking aspect of these forests is how much of them still exists. Many of the plant groups that dominated then have descendants in our own time. Conifers still stand in pine and spruce forests. Cycads survive in scattered tropical and subtropical pockets, often as rare remnants clinging to suitable habitats. Ginkgos grow in cities and gardens as living fossils. Ferns and horsetails still persist with forms not so different from those that thrived under dinosaur feet. To look at these plants today is to peer directly into the Mesozoic, to see something that has endured more than 200 million years of change. When you picture dinosaurs in their true environments, these forests of giants give them context. A sauropod without trees to reach into is only half imagined. A hadrosaur without cycads to crop feels incomplete. Even predators make more sense when you place them among ferns and conifers, lurking in shadowy undergrowth or pacing along the edges of open groves of ginkgos. The plants were not simply background scenery. They were the stage itself, shaping every movement in the drama. The Mesozoic climate provided the conditions these forests needed. For much of the era, greenhouse conditions prevailed. Temperatures were generally warm. Polar regions lacked permanent ice sheets. Forests reached almost to the poles. Petrified wood and fossil leaves in what are now Arctic and Antarctic regions reveal that forests of ginkgos and conifers once grew, where we now imagine icy emptiness. Dinosaurs lived there too, adapted to long seasonal darkness, though not to deep, freezing cold. The plants preserve this history clearly. Their fossils trace the boundaries of climates far warmer than ours. Yet the forests were not all the same. In dry continental interiors, tough conifers dominated, built to withstand limited water. In wetter areas, ferns and horsetails spread along lakeshores and river margins. Cycads grew densely in some places, forming low canopies. Each region had its own pattern of vegetation, and each pattern supported its own mix of animals. As today, plant diversity gave rise to animal diversity. Where plants spread broadly, herbivores flourished. Where herbivores flourished, predators followed. The forests were the foundation. Everything else was built atop their roots and branches. Thinking about these forests also shifts how we feel about time. Plants grow with a quiet patience. Their trunks thicken year by year. Their rings record droughts, floods, and volcanic ash falls. Some Mesozoic conifers may have lived for centuries, perhaps even longer standing in the same spot while generations of dinosaurs were born, grew, and died beneath them. Imagine a tree that germinated while one group of dinosaurs dominated, was still alive when another group rose to prominence, and remained standing as yet another lineage faded into extinction. These plants were relative constants in a world of constant motion. Their fossils remind us of this quiet endurance. Petrified forests preserve the architecture of trunks that once soared upward. Leaf impressions and fine sediments capture the delicate shapes of ginkgo fans and cycad fronds. Cones fossilized in surprising detail show us exactly how these plants reproduced, as though time paused for a moment to save them. Through these traces, we can reconstruct not just abstract categories of vegetation, but living, breathing forests. The plants of the Mesozoic were giants not only in stature but in importance. They structured the world, provided energy and oxygen, and formed the base of every terrestrial food chain. Without them, dinosaurs would have had no diets to support their growth, no habitats to shelter their young, no environmental framework within which to thrive. The forests carried the age as much as the animals did. Their roots reached deep into soils, their crowns pressed against the sky, and their lives intertwined with every creature that walked, flew, or crept nearby. So when we picture the Mesozoic, we must see not just the animals, but the greenery that surrounded them. To see the forests is to see the age more clearly, to understand that this was a world of giants made of wood and leaf as much as of bone and muscle. When we think about the Mesozoic, the images that come most readily are almost always of land. Animals striding across floodplains or threading through forests. But the air they breathed, the invisible envelope of atmosphere around them, was just as important as the ground underfoot. The mix of gases, the levels of oxygen and carbon dioxide, the global temperatures, the storms and droughts, all of this shaped what was possible. The plants that could grow, the animals that could flourish, and the ways ecosystems formed and fell apart were all guided by the character of the atmosphere above. To understand those long millions of years, you must imagine not only the visible landscapes, but the unseen conditions that made them viable. At the beginning of the Mesozoic, the Earth was still reeling. The massive extinction at the end of the Permian had disrupted every part of the biosphere, and the atmosphere was no exception. Volcanic outbursts on colossal scales had loaded the air with gases. Carbon dioxide levels were high. Global temperatures soared. The early Triassic was a hot, arid time. Much of Pangaea's interior dried into extensive deserts broken only by scattered rivers and lakes. Rainfall was limited and inconsistent. On the coasts, where ocean moisture could reach, pockets of greenery persisted, but large swaths of land remained harsh. Plants were among the first to reclaim these spaces, spreading wherever conditions barely allowed. Ferns often led the way, colonizing disturbed ground quickly. They were joined by hardier conifers and cycads capable of enduring drought and poor soils. Slowly, lands stripped of life began to green again. Animals that survived had to adjust to a world with little stability. Amphibians, though diminished, clung to rivers and lakes, some still large enough to prey on fish and small reptiles. Early reptiles of many kinds filled the empty roles left by extinction. Some grew into bulky, armored plant eaters, their bodies protected by plates and scutes. Others became quick predators, chasing insects or smaller vertebrates. The Triassic was full of evolutionary experiments lineages trying new shapes, new diets, new ways of moving. Many of those experiments would eventually fail, leaving no descendants. But that is how life, after catastrophe, finds its way forward. Among the key survivors were the Archosaurs, a group of reptiles that included the ancestors of crocodiles, pterosaurs, and dinosaurs. In the early Triassic, these animals weren't yet dominant. Many Archosaurs were small and unremarkable, competing with other reptiles for space and resources. But they possessed traits that would eventually give them an edge: more efficient lungs, more upright postures, and versatile body plans. For tens of millions of years, they shared the world with other reptiles that seemed better equipped, larger, heavier, more imposing. Yet the Archosaurs held on, enduring and diversifying in the background. The oceans also rebuilt themselves beneath a changing sky. Early in the Triassic, they were often warm and low in oxygen, constraining what could live there. But as time passed, new fish lineages expanded, and marine reptiles began to venture in. Ichthyosaurs started their rise, still somewhat clumsy compared to the streamlined forms they would later take, but already committed to life in the water. Nothosaurs, semi-aquatic reptiles, glided through shallow seas, snapping up fish with long jaws. Ammonites returned and multiplied, coiled shells once again drifting in abundance. Piece by piece, marine food webs reassembled under the same warming, carbon-rich air that was reshaping the land. Over the course of the Triassic, atmospheric oxygen, which had fallen after the Permian, gradually crept upward. Plants spread, drawing down carbon dioxide and releasing oxygen. Still, the balance of gases was not what it is now. Oxygen was often lower, and carbon dioxide higher, keeping the planet warm and contributing to the broad deserts of the continental interior. This imbalance favored certain kinds of animals. Reptiles with efficient respiratory systems and heat-adapted bodies had a distinct advantage. Mammals, still tiny and mostly active in cooler hours, survived by staying in the shadows of night and niche environments where temperatures were gentler. By the Jurassic, the atmosphere had shifted again. Oxygen levels climbed, possibly even exceeding modern levels at times, while carbon dioxide stayed elevated enough to maintain a warm climate. These conditions encouraged lush vegetation and supported large body sizes. When you look at the enormous sauropods of the Jurassic, you're not seeing only a creative evolutionary outcome, but also an atmosphere that made that outcome feasible. Higher oxygen would have made it easier for large animals to fuel their metabolisms. Elevated carbon dioxide, coupled with warm, moist climates, allowed plants to grow quickly and abundantly, providing the vast quantities of food needed to support entire herds of giants. The air itself was part of the reason dinosaurs could grow larger than any land animals before or since. Jurassic climates varied from place to place, but were generally wetter and more hospitable than the early Triassic. monsoon systems likely swept across continental interiors, delivering seasonal rains. Forests expanded, with ferns, cycads, and conifers filling wide areas. Humidity allowed amphibians to persist in more places, while warmth allowed reptiles to thrive almost everywhere. Even near the poles, seasonal forests of conifers and ginkgos grew, where winter brought months of darkness but not the severe cold we associate with high latitudes today. The Earth was warmer overall, from equator to pole. The greenhouse effect was strong and steady. The Cretaceous, the last phase of the Mesozoic, brought another shift in the atmospheric story. Carbon dioxide levels climbed again, possibly reaching several times modern values. Greenhouse conditions intensified. Sea levels rose. Shallow seas spilled onto continents. Warm, humid conditions extended into regions that are temperate or dry today. North America, split by the western interior seaway, became a puzzle of coastal plains, river deltas, and wetlands. Europe broke into a scatter of islands. In these conditions, flowering plants spread rapidly, filling the air with new scents and changing the chemistry of both land and atmosphere. Oxygen levels in the Cretaceous fluctuated but generally remained higher than in the Triassic. This mixture of generous oxygen and high carbon dioxide produced unusual conditions. Large animals continued to thrive, and ecosystems supported extraordinary biodiversity. Throughout most of the Mesozoic, the planet appears to have been largely ice-free. No extensive permanent ice caps cap the poles, though seasonal snow may still have occurred at high latitudes and elevations. Such a climate fueled strong evaporation over warm seas, loading the air with moisture. That, in turn, drove vigorous storms and heavy rains in many regions. Monsoon systems may have been intense, drenching inland seas and lowlands. At the same time, not all places were wet. Some interior regions remained arid, enduring long stretches with little rainfall. The Mesozoic climate mosaic included humid coasts, seasonal monsoon belts, and dry deserts, all coexisting under the same broadly warm greenhouse regime. The air itself might have felt subtly different to breathe. Higher carbon dioxide supported rapid plant growth, but also meant plants released larger amounts of organic compounds. Resins, saps, and defensive chemicals would have infused forests with strong odors, sharp, bitter, or piney. A Mesozoic forest likely smelled more pungent and resin-rich than many of our modern woodlands, where floral scents and broadleaf litter play a much larger role. To walk through that atmosphere would be to inhale the chemistry of a different balance of gases and plant defenses. Volcanoes were constant participants in this atmospheric story. Throughout the Mesozoic, eruptions injected gases into the air, maintaining high carbon dioxide levels and periodically disturbing climate. Massive volcanic provinces like those that erupted at the end of the Triassic and near the end of the Cretaceous altered the atmosphere dramatically. They could warm the planet over long spans by releasing greenhouse gases, yet also cool it in the short term by lofting ash and sulfur aerosols that reflected sunlight. These relatively rapid swings in climate, measured on geological timescales, stressed ecosystems and contributed to extinctions. The atmosphere was not a static backdrop. It was a restless system, tied directly to tectonic activity below and to the photosynthetic activity of the forests and seas above. As continents rearranged, so did winds and ocean currents. Pangaea's immense bulk in the Triassic produced extreme conditions in its interior, hot, dry, far from the moderating effects of oceans. But as it fractured, new coastlines formed. New patterns of atmospheric circulation emerged. Inland seas like those of the Cretaceous created regional climates far wetter and more moderate than those same latitudes experienced today. You could have stood in an area that is now semi-arid and felt a warm, humid breeze instead. The atmosphere also nudged evolution in subtler ways. Insects, for example, tend to grow larger when oxygen levels are high because their breathing systems depend on diffusion through tiny tubes. In earlier ages of very high oxygen, dragonflies achieved wingspans much larger than today. By the Mesozoic, oxygen levels had settled into a range that limited such gigantism. Still, Shifts in atmospheric composition influenced how large certain animals could become, how active they could be, and how quickly they could grow. Dinosaurs themselves were adapted to the air they breathed. Their lungs, similar in many respects to those of modern birds, were likely more efficient than mammalian lungs. That would have allowed them to function effectively even when oxygen was lower than today. Their large bodies were supported by abundant vegetation made possible by elevated carbon dioxide and warm climates. Their distribution across the globe reaching nearly to the poles was made possible by the lack of permanent ice and the warmth carried by the global greenhouse. By the end of the Cretaceous, the atmosphere was in turmoil again. Vast volcanic eruptions in what is now India, the Deccan Traps, released enormous quantities of gas, altering climate once more. Then the asteroid struck, throwing dust, vapor, and aerosols into the upper atmosphere, blocking sunlight and triggering rapid global cooling. The same air that had fostered the age of reptiles turned hostile in those last years, helping to bring that age to an end. Yet across the entire Mesozoic, the atmosphere was in some ways remarkably stable compared with earlier eons. For nearly 200 million years, Earth remained generally warm, largely free of major ice sheets, and rich enough in oxygen to support large, active animals on a global scale. That consistency of conditions allowed reptiles to rise and retain their dominance, allowed forests to spread, and ecosystems to achieve great complexity. The air and climate of the Mesozoic were not incidental details. They were the foundation of the entire age. When you draw breath today, the mixture of gases in your lungs is the result of billions of years of interactions among geology, oceans, and life. In the Mesozoic, every breath taken by a dinosaur, every gust of wind bending a cycad grove, every thunderstorm sweeping across an inland sea was part of a different balance, one that supported a world both unfamiliar and yet deeply connected to our own. To imagine that air is to imagine the age more fully, not just as scenes and sounds, but as the planet's very breath carrying life forward. The Triassic opens in the shadow of loss. Earth had just passed through the most devastating mass extinction in its entire history. The event at the end of the Permian that left the planet scarred and emptied. The oceans had been stripped of most of their life. Reefs had collapsed. Vast stretches of land that had once held forests and swamps lay barren. Perhaps 90% of marine species and a huge portion of land animals were gone. For a time, the world must have felt strangely quiet, food webs broken, communities dismantled, survivors scattered. To picture the dawn of the Triassic is to imagine a planet beginning again, not from nothing, but from scattered remnants. The atmosphere was still unsettled. Immense volcanic eruptions had filled the air with gases, leaving climate unstable. Carbon dioxide was high, oxygen was low, global temperatures were elevated. Much of Pangaea, the supercontinent, was dry, its interior consumed by deserts broken only here and there by rivers and lakes. Along the margins where moisture was more reliable, pockets of green endured, but much of the land was harsh. Plants were among the first to reclaim it. Ferns often led the advance, colonizing churned or bare ground quickly. Then came tougher conifers and cycads, able to withstand drought and poor soils. Little by little, landscapes that had been stripped nearly bare began to show patches of green again. The animals that endured this transition had to cope with a world short on predictability. Amphibians, though greatly reduced, still haunted rivers and lakes, some of them large enough to feast on fish and smaller reptiles. Early reptiles diversified into many forms, filling vacant roles. Some developed into heavy, armored herbivores with bony plates shielding their backs. Others became swift, lightly built predators chasing insects and small vertebrates. The Triassic was crowded with evolutionary experiments, lineages trying new body designs and ways of life, many of which would eventually leave no living descendants. It was a time when success was measured not by dominance but by sheer persistence. Within this turbulent scene, the archosaurs, those reptiles that would give rise to crocodiles, pterosaurs, and dinosaurs, were especially important. In the early Triassic, they were not the obvious rulers. Many remained small, inconspicuous, living alongside a variety of other reptiles that seemed better adapted or more imposing. But the archosaurs carried subtle advantages: upright postures, more efficient lungs, and skeletons capable of evolving into very different sizes and shapes. They were waiting, in effect, for the right shift in circumstance. The oceans continued their slow recovery as well. At first, many regions of sea were hot and low and oxygen hostile to complex life. Gradually, though, new fish lineages spread. Marine reptiles moved from shorelines into deeper waters. Ichthyosaurs, still in early, less streamlined forms, began their ascent toward full aquatic life. Nothosaurs swam in shallow seas, their long bodies and jaws adapted for chasing fish along coastlines. Ammonites multiplied again, their coils drifting with the currents. Bit by bit, marine communities pieced themselves back together. On land, the first big herbivores of the Triassic were not dinosaurs. They were other reptiles, including sizable crocodile relatives that grew into armored giants. Some walked on all fours, their bodies low and heavily built. Others reared onto their hind legs, still covered in armor. These animals grazed on cycads and conifers, roaming plains and woodlands. Other crocodile kin became predators, some of them running with long hind limbs, chasing prey across floodplains. For much of the Triassic, these creatures, not dinosaurs, were the primary rulers of terrestrial ecosystems. But the Triassic was a long interval, spanning nearly 50 million years, and change never stopped. As the period progressed, the first true dinosaurs appeared. At first they were small, light, and easily overshadowed by other reptiles. They fed on insects, small vertebrates, or whatever they could scavenge. But their upright legs allowed efficient running. Their lungs likely managed oxygen better than those of many rivals. Their bones were strong, yet light. Slowly, they expanded their range, still in the background but becoming more numerous. The world they inhabited was still strange. With Pangaea unbroken, barriers to animal movement were minimal. In theory, an animal could walk from what is now North America across into Europe, Asia, and down into Africa without crossing an ocean. This meant ecosystems could be broadly similar across vast distances. It also meant climate extremes were accentuated. Far from the sea, Pangaea's interior baked under heat, with rain rarely reaching it. Life clustered where water existed along coasts, river corridors, and oases, leaving huge expanses nearly lifeless. Volcanic activity was common. Lava flows spilled across landscapes. Earthquakes shifted coastlines. These forces destroyed, but they also created. Fresh lava fields weathered into rich soils that eventually supported new plant growth. Each eruption, each quake, reset parts of the landscape, and life returned, again and again. The Triassic was defined less by stability than by resilience. Survival meant enduring frequent upheavals. Toward the end of the Triassic, another crisis struck. Around 201 million years ago, enormous volcanic eruptions linked to the first splitting of Pangaea flooded regions with lava and gases. Carbon dioxide surged, climate shifted abruptly, ecosystems faltered. Many of the dominant reptile groups, including most of those crocodile relatives that had ruled the land, vanished. Dinosaurs, still not yet at their full power, but more adaptable and widespread than many competitors, survived. When the extinction cleared, they found themselves in a world of open possibilities. The event that closed the Triassic was their opportunity, and in the Jurassic that followed, they began their rise toward true dominance. But the Triassic itself was more than a mere prelude. It was the age of rebuilding after the greatest crisis life had yet seen. A time when ecosystems were stitched back together from fragments, when plants spread across desolate ground, and animals tried out forms that seem almost otherworldly today. Walking through a Triassic landscape in your mind, you would see raw, changing terrain. You'd breathe air sometimes heavy with volcanic gases, clearer in places where forests had gained a foothold. You'd see rivers slicing through deserts, their banks crowded with amphibians and reptiles, while the surrounding sands remained empty and silent. You'd hear odd reptilian calls, the splash of marine creatures in shallow seas, and the harsh rustling of cycads in hot, dry winds. It would be a world both fragile and determined, battered but rebuilding, wounded but alive with stubborn attempts to endure. That resilience is perhaps the key to understanding the Triassic. Life had been nearly erased, yet it did not end. Ferns sprouted on scorched ground, insects shifted diets, reptiles diversified into shapes no one would have predicted. From catastrophe came renewal. From renewal came the beginning of the age of dinosaurs. When we think of dinosaurs, our imagination usually jumps straight to the giants towering sauropods with necks raised like living towers, or huge predators whose jaws could engulf a person in an instant. But that is not how their story started. The rise of dinosaurs was not a sudden takeover, but a slow ascent from small, easily overlooked beginnings. They began as modest-sized creatures that might not have caught your eye if you walked through a Triassic valley, blending into the background among other reptiles. Their story is one of endurance, gradual adaptation, and seizing the moment when conditions finally turned in their favor. In the earliest Triassic, dinosaurs didn't exist at all. The world was still largely ruled by other reptiles, especially those related to modern crocodiles. These came in many forms: armored, fleet-footed, semi-aquatic, and massive carnivores on land. They filled many of the roles we might naively assume would belong to dinosaurs, leaving the first dinosaurs to carve out small, unimpressive niches. When the earliest true dinosaurs did appear around 230 million years ago, they were neither enormous nor particularly imposing. Most were no larger than a person or a medium-sized dog. They ran on two legs, with slender frames and sharp teeth for catching insects or small vertebrates. One of the earliest known, Eoraptor from what is now Argentina, was a small, lightly built animal under a meter long, with grasping hands and a mouth of sharp teeth. It doesn't seem to have been highly specialized, neither strictly a meat eater nor fully a plant eater, but something in between, feeding on whatever it could catch or scavenge. Another early dinosaur, Herrerasaurus, was larger up to about 3 meters. Clearly a predator, it had long legs for running and a flexible skull with sharp teeth. These animals lived among many non-dinosaurian reptiles. To an observer standing in their world, they wouldn't have stood out as the destined rulers of Earth. They were simply part of a larger cast of small to medium-sized creatures. What set dinosaurs apart, though, were a few key traits. They held their legs upright beneath their bodies, rather than sprawled to the sides like lizards and crocodiles. This posture made them efficient walkers and runners, able to travel long distances without exhausting themselves. Their hips and joints were structured to support this stance, giving them a mechanical edge. Their lungs were likely more efficient, somewhat like those of modern birds, allowing them to draw more oxygen from each breath. On a landscape of extremes, long, dry seasons, patchy resources. Being small, mobile, and energy efficient was a significant advantage. As the Triassic wore on, different branches of dinosaurs began to specialize. Some evolved toward more dedicated predation, sharper claws, faster legs, and jaws better suited to tearing flesh. These forms would eventually give rise to the theropods, a group that includes later icons like Allosaurus and Tyrannosaurus, and, much later still, birds. Other lines lean toward plant eating. Their teeth broadened to grind vegetation. Their necks lengthened to reach higher foliage. These forms would lead to the great sauropods of the Jurassic and various other herbivorous lineages. Still others explored mixed diets and intermediate sizes. The early dinosaur family tree was full of experiments, many of which would eventually be pruned away. The real turning point for dinosaurs came not only from their own evolutionary progress, but from a major environmental shift. At the end of the Triassic, the same volcanic eruptions that helped split Pangaea also triggered another mass extinction. Huge outpourings of lava and gas altered climate drastically. Many of the dominant reptile groups that had overshadowed dinosaurs, especially large crocodile relatives, were heavily pruned or wiped out. Amphibians lost much of their diversity. Once again, ecosystems emptied. And dinosaurs, small but dispersed and adaptable, survived. When the dust and ash finally settled, they found a world with many ecological spaces suddenly vacant. In the early Jurassic, they began to expand rapidly. Freed from many of their principal rivals, they radiated into new roles. Plant-eating dinosaurs grew larger, evolving into long-necked sauropods that could graze from the tops of conifers and cycads. Predatory dinosaurs increased in size and specialization, becoming more effective hunters capable of tackling large prey. New forms arose in coastal environments, forest habitats, and open plains. The small, lightly built survivors of the Triassic gradually became the giants of the Jurassic not overnight, but through a long sequence of incremental steps. Their rise wasn't just about size. Dinosaurs also developed social and reproductive strategies that helped them spread. Many laid eggs in nests, and there is evidence that at least some species guarded these nests or cared for hatchlings, giving their offspring a better chance at survival. Some moved in groups or herds, gaining safety in numbers and efficiency in finding food. Their physiologies allowed continuous growth. Some species may have grown quickly through their vulnerable youth, reaching sizes where most predators would no longer risk attacking them. These intertwined behaviors and adaptations helped turn them from mere survivors into the dominant land animals of their time. Looking back, it's tempting to see their success as inevitable, as if dinosaurs were destined to rule. But in their own era, their ascendancy depended on timing, chance, and resilience. They were one branch among many, facing the same environmental challenges. Their rise was not a single dramatic leap, but a long accumulation of small advantages: slightly better lungs, a more upright posture, a more flexible diet, a lighter but strong skeleton. Each of these on its own was modest. Together, over millions of years, they made all the difference. Imagine standing in a Triassic woodland as one of the earliest dinosaurs passes by. It doesn't tower over you. It doesn't shake the ground. It might only reach your knee or hip, slipping quickly through the ferns before you can fully register its shape. Another, slightly larger one sprints after a lizard, vanishing into patchy shade. Your attention might be drawn instead to the heavy, armored herbivores nearby, or to the imposing crocodile-like carnivore by the river. Yet it is those small, lightly built creatures in the background that will, in time, shape an entire age. Their story is a reminder of how evolution usually works. Not with abrupt, miraculous transformations, but with countless small adjustments, each one buying a little more time, a slightly better chance of survival. Dinosaurs rose not because they were instantly superior, but because they were tough, adaptable, and ready to exploit change when it came. They were survivors first, and giants later. By the time the Jurassic began, Earth had been transformed by repeated loss. The Great Extinction at the end of the Triassic had cut down many of the dominant reptiles, opening ecological space for something new. Among the survivors were dinosaurs, still modest in size compared to the colossi they would become, but already spread widely. The stage was set, and in the Jurassic the transformation was unmistakable. The planet settled into a period of warmth, greenness, and abundance. In that setting, dinosaurs became not just persistent, but preeminent. Pangaea, which had defined the Triassic, began to fracture more fully. Rifts opened, seas flooded into low-lying areas, carving the first shapes of the modern Atlantic and splitting continents apart. With these new coastlines came altered climates. Regions that had been parched interiors now received more rain as moist winds rolled in from nearby seas. Rivers lengthened and branched. Floodplains expanded. Forests flourished in the improved conditions. The Jurassic world was richer and more forgiving than the one before it. This greening allowed herbivorous dinosaurs to grow to astonishing sizes. Among them were the sauropods, the giants that defined the Jurassic landscape in many people's minds. Creatures like Brachiosaurus and Diplodocus lifted their necks high into the canopy or swept them low across open ground, pulling plants into their mouths in quantities nearly beyond comprehension. They were immense. Some species may have stretched over 30 meters in length and weighed more than 70 tons. To stand near one would have been to feel very small, confronted with an animal as large as a moving hill. And they did not exist as lone marvels. Evidence suggests they gathered at least sometimes in groups, moving together across valleys and floodplains, eating as they went and reshaping the vegetation in their paths. The very land was adjusted to support them because the climate and plant life allowed for that much biomass. Without warm, humid conditions and extensive forests, such extremes of body size would have been impossible. Alongside sauropods, other herbivores filled the middle layers of the ecosystem. Stegosaurs, with their paired rows of plates and spiked tails, fed on low plants. Their armor may have served not just as defense, but as display or for temperature regulation. Early ornithopods, relatives of the later duck, billed dinosaurs, nibbled at vegetation with jaws that could handle a variety of plant materials. These smaller and medium-sized herbivores browsed at different heights, ensuring that from ground cover to treetops, little was left untouched. Where herbivores prospered, predators did too. The Jurassic hosted formidable carnivores, many of them theropods. Allosaurus, perhaps the best known of these, was a large predator in what is now North America. With a powerful jaw filled with serrated teeth and strong hind legs, it was built for active hunting. It may have hunted alone or in loose groups, targeting large sauropods or stegosaurs, exploiting any sign of weakness. Other theropods around the world filled similar roles, varying in size and shape but united by their carnivorous adaptations. Smaller species chased quick prey. Medium-sized hunters may have focused on juvenile sauropods or agile ornithopods. The Jurassic skies were not empty, either. Pterosaurs, having first appeared in the late Triassic, expanded into many forms. Some were insect eaters, gliding through forests. Others were fish eaters, diving along coasts. A few grew large enough to rival or exceed modern birds of prey in wingspan. They rode air currents above shorelines, marshes, and inland plains, adding a third dimension to the ecosystem. The seas followed their own trajectory of richness. Ichthyosaurs remained important predators. Plesiosaurs and pliosaurs filled roles from agile fish hunters to apex killers. Marine crocodiles patrolled coasts. Fish schools shimmered in shallow bays. Ammonites, as ever, revolved through the water column. These were not empty or simple oceans, but thriving, multi-layered systems intimately connected to the climate and tectonics of the time. The plants of the Jurassic were the quiet architects behind this flourishing. Conifers rose tall and thick. Cycads clustered in open areas. Ginkgos spread their fans in temperate zones, and ferns and horsetails filled understories and wetlands. Together they produced the oxygen, shade, and food that sustained the age. The air itself would have been laden with the sharp scent of conifer resin, the earthy smell of damp undergrowth. Climate played a crucial role in all of this. The Jurassic was warm and relatively stable. No large, permanent ice caps capped the poles. Seasonal changes existed, but at high latitudes they meant darkness without deep, enduring cold. Rainfall was generous in many regions, feeding rivers and lakes that made wide belts of land fertile. The greenhouse world of the Jurassic allowed life to expand both in number and in scale. As the continents drifted farther apart, their differences increased. North America supported extensive floodplains and forests full of sauropods and their predators. Europe, broken by shallow seas, turned into an archipelago of islands, each hosting its own smaller, more isolated communities of dinosaurs. Africa and Asia nurtured their own giants and predators, with lineages distinct to each region. Yet everywhere, the same core pattern reappeared. Abundant plants, large herbivores, and powerful predators. What makes the Jurassic so memorable is the combination of size and scale. Dinosaurs had existed before, but now they filled out the roles that would define them in our imagination. They became the archetypal giants of land, shaping their ecosystems simply through their sheer physical presence. The world became a place where dinosaurs were unavoidable. No forest or open plain could be imagined without them. Their social lives likely deepened their success. Fossil evidence suggests some sauropods moved in herds, with small individuals sheltered among larger ones. Tracks reveal groups moving in parallel. Stegosaurs may have used their plates and spikes for display to one another as much as for defense against predators. Thermoregulatory or visual signals could have helped them identify mates or deter rivals. Large predators may have tolerated one another at kills or engaged in some degree of group hunting, though the details are still debated. These behaviors suggest flexibility, coordination, and at least a modest level of intelligence traits that matter in dynamic environments. To imagine a day in the Jurassic world, you must think of constant motion. Herds of sauropods edging across a plain, predators watching from a distance, pterosaurs tracing patterns overhead, ferns flattening beneath heavy steps, rivers surging after seasonal rains. The soundscape would have been vast, low calls echoing through trees, splashes of marine reptiles near coasts, the crash of vegetation under the weight of giants, and the steady background hum of insects. Through it all, dinosaurs solidified their place. From their small beginnings in the Triassic, they had, by the Jurassic, become the unchallenged rulers of terrestrial ecosystems. Their success lay not only in being large, but in being diverse and adaptable enough to occupy nearly every available niche. They had not yet reached their highest diversity, that would come later, in the Cretaceous, but they had achieved something new. Dominance across entire continents for stretches of time we can barely comprehend. The Jurassic world was green, fertile, and filled with mighty animals. In that era, it almost seems as though Earth itself conspired in their favor, offering climates, coastlines, and forests that allowed them to thrive. To walk that world would have been to move through a landscape defined by dinosaurs, not as rare curiosities, but as the backbone of life on land. Among all the creatures that have ever walked the earth, few embody sheer scale the way the great sauropods do. When people think of dinosaurs, they often picture necks arching above treetops, tails sweeping across plains, and bodies so massive that the ground seems to vibrate beneath them. These were the titans of the Jurassic and Cretaceous, a lineage that endured across millions of years in almost every continent. Their rise was gradual, built on a series of opportunities provided by a warm, green world. Once they appeared in their full form, they pushed the limits of what life on land could be. Sauropods began as relatively modest animals in the late Triassic. Small, lightly built plant eaters, not yet the gargantuan figures we know. Even then, their anatomy hinted at what was possible. Their necks were lengthening. Their skeletons were becoming lighter for their size. Their limbs were straighter and more column-like, capable of bearing heavy weight. They were, in a sense, pre-adapted for expansion, ready to grow into roles no other land animals had occupied. By the Jurassic, these tendencies had come together in full. The environment provided the rest. Forests of conifers, cycads, and ginkgos spread widely, feeding on high carbon dioxide and warm conditions. Plant growth was fast and abundant. River systems nourished extensive floodplains. In such a world, being able to consume huge quantities of coarse plant matter became a profound advantage. Sauropods answered that challenge in extreme form. Their long necks allowed them to cover large feeding areas while moving relatively little. Their peg-like or spoon-shaped teeth were suited to stripping foliage rather than chewing it thoroughly. Digestion happened largely in their vast guts. They were not delicate feeders choosing select leaves. They were bulk grazers and browsers, designed to take in enormous volumes of plant material and extract enough energy to sustain their titanic bodies. Their size was not mere excess. Being enormous was a survival strategy. Fully grown sauropods were likely nearly invulnerable to most predators. Even the largest theropods, like Allosaurus in the Jurassic or later Tyrannosaurs, would have thought carefully before attacking an adult. The risk of injury from a massive swinging tail or a crushing foot was significant. Size also gave sauropods access to food unavailable to smaller herbivores. High branches beyond the reach of stegosaurs, early ornithopods, or other ground-level grazers. Their great mass made it easier to maintain stable body temperatures, buffering them against daily fluctuations. Grow big became a route to safety, to food, and to stability. The engineering of their bodies is remarkable. Sauropod bones were riddled with air spaces, making them lighter while retaining strength. Their vertebrae were complex structures of struts and cavities, distributing forces efficiently. Their lungs were probably similar to those of birds, with air sacs extending through the body. This system allows continuous airflow and efficient gas exchange, crucial when you need to oxygenate a huge volume of tissue. Their long necks were supported by robust muscles and ligaments, anchored to vertebrae shaped to interlock and brace against bending. Their limbs were straight, pillar-like supports, transferring weight vertically down to broad feet. Every part of their anatomy reflects a design pushed to extremes, and yet so successful that it persisted for well over 100 million years. Different sauropod lineages adapted to different feeding strategies. Brachiosaurus and its relatives carried their necks more upright, feeding high in the canopy, perhaps taking the roles that modern giraffes occupy among mammals, but on a far grander scale. Diplodocus and similar forms extended their necks more horizontally, sweeping wide arcs across low vegetation. Some may have used their exceptionally long tails, thin and whip-like, as defensive or communicative tools, potentially even cracking them with a sonic boom. These variations reflect the diversity of environments they inhabited. In some regions, tall conifer forests dominated. In others, more open landscapes with low-growing plants prevailed. Sauropods adapted accordingly. Their presence shaped the environment around them. Entire plant communities may have evolved under constant pressure from these giant herbivores. Vegetation patterns were likely different in areas with heavy sauropod traffic than in those without. As they moved, they trampled undergrowth, opened paths through dense vegetation, and churned soils. Their dung returned vast quantities of nutrients to the ground, feeding insects, microorganisms, and plants. In that sense, sauropods were ecosystem engineers, reshaping the land just by existing. Despite their eventual size, they started life small. Fossil nests show that sauropods laid eggs, usually not much larger than a grapefruit or a small melon. To produce a young sauropod as large as a cow at birth would require either impossible egg sizes or an entirely different reproductive strategy, so they began tiny relative to their adult size. The young would have been vulnerable to predators of many kinds: theropods, crocodile relatives, even large mammals or other reptiles. Survival likely depended on growing quickly and perhaps staying near groups of other young or adults. Some fossil trackways suggest herds dominated by juveniles, which may indicate age-segregated group behavior, where young traveled together while adults ranged more widely. Predators adapted to these dynamics, focusing on the more vulnerable stages. Bite marks on sauropod bones, especially from smaller individuals, show that attacks were common. Carnivores may have harassed herds at the edges, looking for opportunities to pick off juveniles. Yet the sauropod strategy as a whole worked. Enough young survived and grew into giants to maintain their populations for tens of millions of years. Their global spread underscores their success. Sauropod remains have been found on every continent, including Antarctica, which, during the Mesozoic, was much warmer than today and capable of supporting forests. They inhabited lush river basins, uplands, and coastal plains. Their adaptability allowed them to exploit a wide range of environments, limited mainly by the availability of sufficient plant matter and suitable climate. In the Cretaceous, sauropods continued to evolve. Titanosaurs, a later group, became especially important. Some titanosaurs, such as Argentinosaurus or Patagotitan, may have surpassed even the largest Jurassic sauropods in size, making them the heaviest land animals known from the fossil record. They persisted in the southern continents until the very end of the Mesozoic, sharing the world with flowering plant forests, hadrosaurs, ceratopsians, and advanced theropods. Their eventual extinction at the end of the Cretaceous was not the result of evolutionary failure. The asteroid impact and massive volcanism that closed the Mesozoic created conditions no large land animals could effectively navigate. For over 100 million years, however, sauropods had been among the most successful forms life ever produced. They remain some of the clearest demonstrations of what evolution can achieve when energy and time are abundant. To stand among them, if that were possible, would be to confront a scale almost beyond ordinary comprehension. A diplodocus sweeping its head past with a slow, deliberate motion, a brachiosaurus reaching calmly into the canopy, a group of titanosaurs moving across a valley like living hills in motion. The ground would quiver under each step. The air would be filled with the sounds of their breathing, their calls, the snapping of branches and the grinding of plant matter. They were not mere curiosities on their landscape. They were the landscape, in a very real sense, defining what large meant on land for more than 100 million years. Even now, their legacy lingers. Birds, In a distant branch of the dinosaur family retain elements of their respiratory systems and bone structures. Fossil trackways mark the paths sauropods walked, preserving the impressions of their feet as if pressed into concrete. In our imagination, too, they loom large. When we think of giants, we often think of them. Their story is one of extremes. Biology stretched almost to the limits of what gravity permits, sustained by the right combination of climate, vegetation, and anatomical innovation. They show us what happens when conditions allow growth to push outward and upward, when an environment can support bodies that, to us, seem almost impossible. If the sauropods set the upper boundary of size among plant eaters, the large theropods tested the limits of size among predators. Predators have always fascinated us. During the dinosaur age, they were both regulators and threats, keeping herbivore populations in check and constantly testing the defenses and behaviors of their prey. For every herd of sauropods or flock of hadrosaurs, there was a carnivore watching from the sidelines or wandering through the landscape in search of an opportunity. These hunters ranged widely in form and size, from small, nimble insect eaters to apex giants, capable of tackling prey many times their own mass. Together, they formed a spectrum of carnivores that wove through every Mesozoic ecosystem. The first theropods appeared back in the Triassic. They were small, then quick, lightly built, taking advantage of insects, small vertebrates, and carrion. They lived alongside larger crocodile relatives and other reptiles that still dominated. Once the end Triassic extinction cleared away many competitors, theropods diversified rapidly. Not all of them grew large. Many remained small and specialized, while others evolved into mid-sized and then very large predators. In the Jurassic, Allosaurus stands out as a prime example of the large theropod. Roughly 8 to 10 meters long on average, it was not the largest predator ever, but still formidable. Its skull housed serrated teeth designed to slice through flesh. Its forelimbs, though shorter than the hind limbs, were strong and ended in claws that could grasp or rake. Its legs were sturdy enough for bursts of speed, though it probably relied as much on ambush and strategy as on pure sprinting. Evidence from bone beds and bite marks suggests that Allosaurus and similar predators may have targeted young or weakened sauropods and stegosaurs, and may have scavenge-fed whenever possible. Whether they hunted cooperatively or simply congregated at kills is still debated, but multiple individuals at some sites hint at complex behavior around food. Across the Jurassic world, other theropods assumed similar roles in different regions. Ceratosaurus, with a distinctive horn on its snout and blade-like teeth, may have lurked along rivers and wetlands, ambushing prey. Megalosaurus in Europe, one of the first dinosaurs ever named scientifically, haunted the patchwork of islands and shallow seas. Smaller predators filled in other niches. Chilophysis, for example, was a slender, lightly built hunter from the late Triassic and early Jurassic. It was only a few meters long, but in groups it could have overwhelmed small prey, feeding mostly on lizards, amphibians, and possibly carrion. Later, small theropods like Compsognathus in the Jurassic or similar forms in the Cretaceous scurried through undergrowth, preying on insects and small vertebrates. These creatures remind us that most predators, even in the dinosaur age, were not giants. They were small, quick, and opportunistic, just as many are today. The layered structure of predator sizes created a complex system. Large theropods influenced populations of big herbivores. Medium-sized hunters focused on smaller dinosaurs or juveniles. The smallest predators kept insect and small vertebrate populations in check. Competition was not just between predators and prey, but among predators themselves. Allosaurus may have disputed carcasses with Ceratosaurus or other meat eaters, each using different strengths to secure food. Smaller theropods had to navigate around these giants, avoiding becoming prey themselves while trying to scavenge scraps. Hunting strategies varied widely. Some predators were built for ambush stocky bodies, strong legs for sudden lunges, features suited to close-range attacks. Others were better adapted for pursuits, with longer legs and lighter builds, made for chasing prey over open ground. Many probably relied heavily on scavenging. In nature, few predators pass up a free meal. The distinction between hunter and scavenger is fluid. Most do both when they can. Fossil evidence of bite marks on already weathered bones hints that large theropods often came in after other animals, or after an animal had died from other causes. In the Cretaceous, the diversity of predators expanded and shifted. New lineages arose, some pushing the upper limits of size even further. Spinosaurus, with its elongated snout and tall sail along its back, appears to have lived a semi-aquatic lifestyle, hunting fish and perhaps wading or swimming in rivers and coastal environments. Its anatomy, long crocodile-like jaws, robust forelimbs, and dense bones suggests it may have spent a great deal of time in water. In Asia, Tarbosaurus, a close relative of Tyrannosaurus, dominated late Cretaceous ecosystems. Its massive skull and powerful bite adapted to crushing bone. In South America, Giganotosaurus and other Carcharodontosaurids grew to impressive sizes, rivaling or exceeding Tyrannosaurs in length, though perhaps not in robustness of skull and bite force. These large theropods were highly specialized, but not all carnivorous dinosaurs were giants. Smaller and mid-sized predators remained crucial. Feathered raptors such as Deinonychus or Velociraptor may have hunted in groups, or at least exploited pack-like tactics when confronting larger prey. Some small theropods evolved feathers not for flight, but for insulation or display. These feathers may have provided camouflage or made visual communication more effective. Over time, in certain lineages, feathers grew more complex and eventually became wings capable of true flight. Thus, within the theropods, one branch led toward birds, which would ultimately carry predation into the air and into a new era. The relationship between predators and their environments went beyond simple hunting. Fossil trackways show paths of movement. Carnivores following herds, traveling along river corridors or pacing shorelines. Bite marks on bones reveal not only kills and scavenging, but also failed attacks that left injuries which later healed. Bone beds with multiple individuals of a single large theropod species may represent drought refuges, feeding sites, or perhaps even some kind of social aggregation. Small predators had to live in a world structured not only by prey availability, but by the hazards posed by larger hunters. They developed behaviors and anatomies to avoid detection nocturnality, camouflage, speed, climbing ability. Together, this spectrum of carnivores ensured that no level of the food web was without checks and balances. Large herbivores could not overgraze indefinitely. Smaller animals could not multiply without constraint. Each predator, from the tiniest insectivore to the largest tyrannosaur, played a part in maintaining ecological equilibrium. To imagine daily life for these hunters is to picture continual motion and calculation. A large theropod might spend hours or days tracking a herd, testing it from a distance, waiting for vulnerability, an injury, a stumble, a moment of panic. A small predator might move swiftly through undergrowth, grabbing insects, raiding nests, stealing scraps from a larger predator's kill, and always listening for sounds that signal danger. Above them, pterosaurs and early birds might circle, eyeing the scene below for any leftover bits of flesh or small animals flushed by the movements of larger ones. Every level of this system was interlocked with the others. The legacy of these predators is not only in their striking skeletons and fearsome teeth, but also in the understanding that dominance comes in many forms. Being the largest carnivore in an ecosystem is only one strategy. Being small, quick, versatile, or intelligent are others. The Mesozoic reminds us that life explores every available avenue from giant bone-crushing jaws to delicate teeth, plucking insects from bark, and that each strategy, in its own way, can succeed. When we turn our gaze upward, we realize that the age of dinosaurs was not just about what walked on land or swam in the seas. It was also about what mastered the air. Long before modern birds emerged in their familiar forms, the skies belonged to other reptiles, the pterosaurs. They spread their wings over coastlines, forests, and plains, making the air as crowded with life as the ground. Pterosaurs were not dinosaurs, though they shared a distant ancestor with them. Their story is intertwined with that of dinosaurs, but distinct. They represent a separate solution to the problem of powered flight. The earliest pterosaurs appeared in the late Triassic. They were relatively small, with wings formed from a skin membrane stretched from the body to an enormously elongated fourth finger. If you look at your own hand and imagine one finger extending several times longer than the rest, bearing a full wing membrane, you get a rough sense of the design. Their bones were thin-walled and hollow, reducing weight. Their muscles were arranged for strong, sustained flapping. Even early forms likely could glide and maneuver skillfully, catching insects or small vertebrates while on the wing. By the Jurassic, pterosaurs had branched into many forms. Some remained tiny, scarcely larger than modern sparrows, flitting after insects. Others grew larger, reaching wingspans of several meters and hunting fish or scavenging along shorelines. Tail length varied. Some had long tails tipped with diamond-shaped veins that may have aided in stability. Others shortened their tails and evolved elaborate bony crests on their skulls. These crests may have served for species recognition, mate attraction, or aerodynamic fine-tuning. Over the seas, many pterosaurs developed long, narrow jaws filled with interlocking teeth, ideal for catching fish. Species like Rhamphorhynchus in later forms may have skimmed just above the water's surface, snapping up prey in quick strikes. They likely filled ecological roles similar to those of seabirds today, nesting on cliffs, gathering in colonies, and following fish schools along coastlines. On land, other pterosaurs fed on small vertebrates, carrion, or even fruits, depending on the species. Their excellent eyesight would have made them effective aerial hunters and scavengers. As time went on, especially by the late Cretaceous, some pterosaurs grew to extraordinary sizes. Quetzalcoatlus and related Ashdarshids reached wingspans of around 10 or even 12 meters. On the ground, they stood taller than a giraffe. These giants were probably not fragile gliders, but strong flyers capable of soaring long distances. They may have launched from the ground using a powerful four-limb takeoff, then ridden thermal currents over vast areas, scanning for food below. On land, they may have stalked like enormous storks, feeding on small animals, carcasses, or anything else they could swallow. Their dominance in the skies lasted for more than 150 million years. During most of that time, birds were only just emerging and diversifying, still small and limited in comparison. But within the theropod dinosaurs, another flight experiment was underway. Feathers had originally evolved for insulation or display, appearing in many small theropods. Over time, in some lineages, feathers became more complex and began to form aerodynamic surfaces. Small, feathered dinosaurs like Microraptor had wings not only on their forelimbs, but also on their hind limbs, hinting at gliding or four-winged flight. Others, such as Anchiornis, show a progression toward the wing shapes we associate with true birds. Archaeopteryx, from late Jurassic rocks in Germany, is one of the most famous of these transitional forms. Its fossils preserve impressions of feathers in remarkable detail. It had fully formed wings and asymmetrical flight feathers, suggesting some ability for powered flight or at least strong gliding. Yet it also had teeth, a long bony tail, and claws on its wings retained features from its dinosaurian ancestry. Archaeopteryx likely climbed among trees and glided short distances, perhaps leaping from branch to branch or escaping predators by launching into the air. Forests of the Jurassic and Cretaceous would have been alive with these small, feathered creatures. Some would clamber up trunks and glide down. Others may have flapped between trees or swooped down to catch insects. Pterosaurs soared higher above, using different flight styles, often larger in size and focusing on other food sources. The sky was not a blank space, but a layered environment with multiple groups of flyers sharing it. Birds and pterosaurs were not always in direct competition. Often they occupied different size ranges, prey types, and ecological roles. But as the Cretaceous progressed, birds expanded into more niches. They lost teeth in many lineages, evolved shorter tails, refined their wings, and improved their flight capabilities. Some became diverse, others specialized as perching insect eaters. Some may have resembled early shorebirds, picking along coasts. In parallel, pterosaurs continued to adapt, some becoming larger and more specialized. Elaborate head crests appeared in many groups, possibly used for display or aerodynamic control. Wings evolved into different shapes for various flight styles, from soaring over oceans to maneuvering through inland environments. Flight carried many advantages. It allowed escape from ground-based predators, access to distant habitats, and exploitation of food that was difficult to reach otherwise. Migratory possibilities opened. Nesting strategies changed, with clutches placed on cliffs, in trees, or on inaccessible ledges. Social behaviors likely grew more complex as flying animals used calls and displays to coordinate and attract mates. The Mesozoic sky would have been filled with noise as well as motion. The screeches and cries of pterosaurs, perhaps the calls of early birds, the rush of wings overhead. By the late Cretaceous, birds had diversified substantially, though they still shared the skies with the pterosaurs. The two lineages coexisted for tens of millions of years. When the end Cretaceous catastrophe struck, pterosaurs disappeared entirely, along with non-avian dinosaurs. Birds, however, survived and radiated into the open aerial world, eventually becoming the nearly 10,000 species we see today. In that sense, birds are the living heirs of both the theropod dinosaur tradition and the broader Mesozoic exploration of the skies. Their flight continues a story that began with early feathered dinosaurs and pterosaurs testing air currents for the first time. To stand on a Jurassic or Cretaceous plain and look up would have been to see constant motion. Pterosaurs circling in the distance, some diving toward water, others gliding inland. Small, feathered dinosaurs gliding among trees, early birds flapping across clearings. The sky was not silent, not empty, but a realm as populated and dynamic as the ground and the sea. As the Mesozoic wore on, the balance between these airborne groups shifted. Pterosaurs remained the giants of the air until the end. Birds steadily refined their flight and spread into more ecological roles. Together, they show that the age of dinosaurs was as much about the awakening of the sky as it was about dominance on land and in water. If you could stand on the shore of a Jurassic or Cretaceous sea, the scene might at first seem familiar. Waves would still roll in. Sand or shingle would still line the edge of the water. Winged creatures would circle overhead, calling as they rode the air. But if you looked beneath the surface, you would find a world utterly different from our modern oceans. There were no whales, no dolphins, no seals. Instead, the seas were ruled by reptiles, crocodile kin, lizard relatives, and independent lineages that had returned to the water and reshaped themselves into powerful swimmers. They were not fish, and they were not dinosaurs, but a distinct collection of marine reptiles that dominated the ancient oceans as thoroughly as dinosaurs ruled the land. The first of these to truly claim the sea were the ichthyosaurs. Their story began in the early Mesozoic, when some reptiles took to hunting in shallow coastal waters after the Permian extinction. Over time, they ventured farther from shore, stayed longer in the water, and gradually abandoned land altogether. Evolution streamlined their bodies into shapes remarkably similar to dolphins and tunas, a testament to how water molds form. Ichthyosaurs developed long snouts filled with sharp teeth, ideal for snatching fish and squid. Their eyes grew very large, helping them see in dim or deeper waters. Their limbs evolved into paddles and their tails became powerful flukes. By the Jurassic, ichthyosaurs ranged from modest sizes to giants over 15 meters long. What's more, they gave birth to live young, no longer returning to land to lay eggs. Fossils show embryos inside adults, and even individuals preserved in the act of giving birth. This adaptation completed their break from the land, making them fully marine animals in life cycle as well as form. Sharing the seas were the plesiosaurs and their close kin. Their body plans were unlike anything alive today. They had broad, barrel-shaped bodies, relatively short tails, and 4 strong flippers that they used in a flying motion underwater. Some were long-necked plesiosaurs. These had dozens of vertebrae in their necks, giving them a flexible reach. With small heads and pointed teeth, they were well suited for hunting small fish and cephalopods, darting their heads rapidly through the water column while their bodies stayed relatively still. Others were short-necked pliosaurs with massive heads and jaws, built more like aquatic crocodiles in function. These were the apex predators of many Jurassic seas, able to tackle other marine reptiles as well as large fish. Modern imagination sometimes turns them into sea monsters, but their fossils are clear and abundant. They were very real and very successful. As we move into the Cretaceous, a new group enters the scene, the Mosasaurs. Mosasaurs were descended from land-dwelling lizards. They adapted to the water astonishingly quickly in evolutionary terms. Their limbs became flippers, their tails elongated, and developed powerful fin tips for propulsion. Their skulls evolved flexible joints and double-hinged jaws, much like those of snakes, allowing them to swallow large prey. Some mosasaurs grew beyond 15 meters. They occupied the top of marine food chains in late Cretaceous seas, preying on fish, squid, ammonites, turtles, birds, and even other mosasaurs. Their rapid diversification and global spread testify to how well they fit the ecological opportunities of the time. Those oceans were not empty between these giants. Ammonites, with their beautifully coiled shells, drifted in staggering numbers. Their shell patterns, the intricate sutures where internal walls met the outer shell, are among the most detailed and varied in the fossil record. Some ammonites were small, others approached a meter across. They were both predators and prey. Their abundance made them a critical part of marine food webs, and their fossils allow scientists to track changes in marine environments through time. Belemnites. Another group of cephalopods resembled streamlined squids with internal bullet-shaped skeletons. They hunted actively in open water, their remains accumulating in large beds in some places. Reefs also thrived, though they were constructed differently than many modern ones. Corals were present, but in many regions, strange bivalves called rudists built towering reef structures. These clams grew into tube-like or conical shapes, clustering together to form dense, complex habitats. Fish and invertebrates crowded into these reef systems, just as they do in coral reefs today. Sharks and rays patrolled their edges. Life in the Mesozoic oceans was full of danger and opportunity. A school of fish might be swept into chaos by an ichthyosaur attack. A long-necked plesiosaur might snake its head silently through a shoal of smaller animals. A mosasaur might erupt from deeper water, crushing a turtle in its jaws. For every spectacular predator, there were countless smaller animals, fish, crustaceans, plankton linking the chain together. Over millions of years, these marine reptiles rose, flourished, and, in some cases, declined even before the final extinction. Ichthyosaurs, for reasons still debated, dwindled and disappeared before the end of the Cretaceous. Changes in climate, ocean chemistry, competition, or prey availability may all have played roles. Plesiosaurs persisted longer, some surviving until the very end of the Mesozoic. Mosasaurs, latecomers to the scene, thrived right up to the boundary event that ended their reign along with the dinosaurs. In each case, their disappearance was tied not simply to competition, but to broader environmental upheavals. To imagine those seas is to imagine motion at all scales: plankton drifting, fish darting, reptiles gliding and lunging, sharks circling, and invertebrates working quietly over the seafloor. It was a world as complex and crowded as modern oceans, shaped by the same rules of energy, predation, and adaptation, but populated by very different players. Even today, we feel their presence in our landscapes. Chalk cliffs built from the shells of plankton, limestone formed from ancient reefs, marine fossils in rock far inland, all are remnants of Mesozoic seas that once covered parts of the continents. The ocean in that age was every bit as alive and dynamic as the forests and plains of the dinosaurs. To tell the story of the Mesozoic without it is to miss half of what made that world what it was. If we focus only on the animals, though, we overlook the deeper forces that shaped their possibilities. Beneath forests, seas, and deserts, the solid earth itself was restless. The arrangement of continents and oceans, the rise of mountains, and the opening of new sea passages all influenced climate, habitats, and evolutionary paths. At the beginning of the Triassic, Earth's landmasses were welded together into Pangaea, a single supercontinent. It stretched nearly from pole to pole, surrounded by a global ocean. This configuration produced extreme conditions. Interiors far from the sea experienced searing heat and aridity. Coasts, by contrast, enjoyed more moderate and moist climates. Mountain ranges marked past collisions between continental blocks, guiding winds and rainfall. As the Triassic gave way to the Jurassic, stress built in Earth's crust. Pangaea began to crack. Rifts opened like slow-moving wounds in the supercontinent's surface. Magma rose through these rifts, forming new oceanic crust as the land pulled apart. The early Atlantic Ocean was born in these widening gaps. Africa, South America, North America, and Europe gradually drifted away from one another. India began its long journey across the Tethys Ocean toward its eventual collision with Asia. Australia and Antarctica remained joined, hanging toward the southern high latitudes. This process unfolded over tens of millions of years far beyond any single creature's lifespan, but its cumulative effects were radical. New coastlines formed, creating fresh, shallow seas rich in nutrients. Continental fragments isolated populations of plants and animals, allowing them to evolve along separate paths. Mountains rose where plates collided, altering rainfall patterns and creating rain shadows and uplands. In North America, tectonic movements that began in the Jurassic and continued into the Cretaceous helped set the stage for what would become the Rocky Mountains. In South America, early uplift and later major orogenies would eventually produce the Andes. In Eurasia, collisions thickened crust and raised mountain belts. These changes weren't just scenic. They shaped where rivers flowed, where soils accumulated, and where plants could take hold. They redirected ocean currents. As continents drifted, ocean basins changed shape and currents shifted. Warm water paths altered, bringing heat to new latitudes and leaving others cooler. This modified climate on a global scale. One dramatic consequence of this geologic reshaping was the formation of large inland seas. During the Cretaceous, high sea levels combined with continental subsidence to flood vast lowland areas. In North America, the western interior seaway split the continent into eastern and western landmasses. This shallow sea was teeming with marine life mosasaurs, plesiosaurs, fish, ammonites, and its shores were home to dinosaurs, pterosaurs, and early birds. To stand in what is now the Great Plains during the Cretaceous would have been to stand near the edge of a shallow, warm ocean where waves lapped far inland and marine reptiles surfaced where today there is only grass and soil. These inland seas served both as barriers and as corridors. They prevented some land animals from crossing, encouraging regional differentiation of dinosaur faunas. At the same time, they allowed marine organisms to disperse widely. The sediments laid down in these seaways accumulated layer upon layer. Long after the seas withdrew, those layers hardened into rock, preserving the fossils we now collect from them. As continents moved, climates changed. Regions that were once humid became drier, as mountains blocked moisture or as ocean currents shifted. Others grew wetter as they moved into tropical latitudes or as sea proximity increased humidity. Tropical belts themselves shifted with tectonic drift. This migration, combined with changes in atmospheric composition, moved zones of lush vegetation across the globe. Dinosaurs, plants, and other organisms had to follow or adapt. Tectonic forces also drove volcanic activity. When continents rifted, great outpourings of lava sometimes occurred. Large igneous provinces, immense accumulations of basaltic lava poured out during key times, such as at the end of the Triassic and near the end of the Cretaceous. These events had global consequences. They released vast quantities of gases, including carbon dioxide and sulfur compounds. Over long periods, increased carbon dioxide contributed to greenhouse warming. Shorter-term releases of aerosols could reflect sunlight and cause cooling. Ecosystems were stressed, reshaped, and sometimes pushed into crisis. The end Triassic mass extinction is closely associated with such volcanic activity. Many groups that had been dominant vanished. Others, including dinosaurs, capitalized on the newly vacated niches. The same deep earth forces that split continents and raised mountains were thus both destroyers and creators of opportunity. To imagine the Mesozoic properly, you need to picture an Earth that did not have its present geography. Maps would look wrong to your eye. No Atlantic as you know it, no Mediterranean in its current form, different arrangements of land and sea. Yet from that shifting mosaic, the outlines of our modern world slowly emerged. The positions of continents, the shapes of ocean basins, and the routes of major currents were all being slowly drafted during the age of dinosaurs. Life responded in kind. Dinosaurs on separate landmasses diverged into distinct groups. Plants spread along new coastlines. Marine communities reorganized as seas advanced and retreated. The story of life and the story of Earth's shifting crust are inseparable. Dinosaurs did not evolve in a static setting. They lived on moving plates, with mountains rising and seas opening underneath them, even if they never knew it. In the background of quiet days, with herds moving across plains and predators stalking in forests, the planet's crust was slowly rearranging itself, setting the boundaries of future continents and the conditions for future climates. All of this unfolded over immense timescales. But sometimes, change happened more suddenly and more violently. The Mesozoic began under the shadow of one catastrophe, and it ended in the light of another. In between, volcanoes erupted, climates shifted abruptly, storms lashed seas and coasts, and ecosystems were periodically pushed to the brink. We often picture the age of dinosaurs as tranquil, a steady, warm, green world. The truth is that it was also an age of instability, punctuated by powerful events that could remake the rules overnight. Volcanic eruptions were frequent at many scales, from modest local events to enormous flood basalts. These eruptions altered landscapes by covering them in lava or ash, abruptly wiping out local ecosystems. In the short term, ash clouds could darken skies, cool regional climates, and damage plant life. Over longer periods, cumulative gas emissions could warm the planet. The end Triassic eruptions, associated with the opening of the central Atlantic, produced lava flows and intrusive rocks that still stretch across multiple continents. They also coincided with a significant extinction event that cleared the way for dinosaurs to expand. Later in the Mesozoic, especially toward the end of the Cretaceous, another enormous volcanic episode unfolded, the eruptions that created the Deccan Traps in what is now India. These outpourings covered much of the region in successive lava flows and released large amounts of gas into the atmosphere. The climatic effects of the Deccan eruptions are still being studied. They likely caused significant warming, ocean acidification, and stress to ecosystems even before the asteroid impact delivered the final blow to non-avian dinosaurs and many other groups. Alongside volcanic fire, there was atmospheric turbulence and oceanic fury. The warm, high sea level world of much of the Mesozoic was prone to intense storms. Inland seas, such as the Western Interior Seaway, would have been especially vulnerable to powerful storm systems. Hurricanes or cyclone-like storms could sweep across their shallow waters, driving waves far onto coastal plains. Sedimentary layers containing chaotic deposits of sand, coarse material, and marine organisms far inland hint at such storm events. For animals living along these shores, dinosaurs, early birds, crocodiles, storm surges could be devastating, sweeping away individuals or entire groups, altering coastlines in a single day. On land, seasonal patterns brought cycles of drought and flood. In some regions, monsoons delivered torrents of rain that swelled rivers, spread over floodplains, and distributed nutrients. In dry seasons, those same rivers shrank, concentrating animals at dwindling water sources and intensifying competition and predation. Lightning ignited fires that burned through forests and plains. Charcoal in Mesozoic sediments reveals that wildfires were common. Some ecosystems adapted to periodic burning. Plants with thick bark or fire-resistant seeds could survive or even depend on such disturbances. For dinosaurs and other animals, fire posed immediate threats but also created new opportunities. Fresh growth after burns could attract herbivores, which in turn attracted predators. Earthquakes, too, were part of the Mesozoic experience, as tectonic plates ground past each other and continents rifted. We have fewer direct traces of individual quakes, but their presence can be inferred from faults, abrupt changes in sedimentary layers, and the broader tectonic context. For animals on the ground, an earthquake would have been a shocking event, trees swaying, ground shifting, perhaps landslides or river course changes. Taken together, these forces meant that life in the Mesozoic was never entirely secure. Even in long stretches of relative climatic stability, local catastrophes could strike, reshaping landscapes and testing the resilience of populations. Life's answer to these challenges was the same as it has always been: adapt, move, or perish. Some animals evolved migratory habits, moving seasonally to follow rainfall or temperature changes. Others broadened their diets, becoming generalists able to exploit multiple food sources. Plants spread quickly into disturbed areas, colonizing fresh ash fields or flood-deposited sediments. Each disturbance cleared space. Each recovery phase opened new paths for diversification. Fossil evidence preserves a few of these moments of disruption with haunting clarity. Ash layers that entomb plant leaves and small animals in exquisite detail mark abrupt events, perhaps single eruptions or short volcanic episodes. Mass death assemblages, where many individuals of the same species are found together, may record herds caught in floods, drought-stricken animals gathered around a drying waterhole, or creatures overwhelmed by toxic gases or ash. Storm layers full of broken shells and scattered bones tell of violent surges. Charcoal layers speak of forests consumed by flame. All these records remind us that the age of dinosaurs was shaped not only by slow, continuous change, but also by sudden, episodic shocks. For all its length and richness, the Mesozoic ended abruptly on a geological timescale. For much of the Cretaceous, life seemed firmly established. Dinosaurs dominated land ecosystems on multiple continents. Marine reptiles controlled the seas. Pterosaurs and birds shared the skies. Flowering plants, insects, and small mammals wove dense and intricate food webs. Yet even during this apparent stability, stressors were accumulating. The Deccan eruptions altered climate and chemistry. Some groups were already in decline. Then, about 66 million years ago, an asteroid impact changed everything. A roughly 10-kilometer wide asteroid slammed into what is now the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. The resulting explosion released energy equivalent to billions of nuclear bombs. The impact excavated a crater over 180 kilometers across and hurled rock, dust, and vapor high into the atmosphere. Shockwaves ripped through the crust. Tsunamis radiated across ancient oceans. Heat pulses ignited fires across enormous distances, fueled partly by re-entering ejecta heating the upper atmosphere and sending intense thermal radiation down to the surface. Charcoal deposits and soot layers from this time record widespread burning. In the days and weeks that followed, the skies darkened. Dust, soot, and sulfur aerosols blocked a significant fraction of incoming sunlight. Temperatures at the surface dropped. Photosynthesis faltered, then failed on large scales. Plants died back or went dormant. Plankton populations crashed. Herbivores found less and less to eat. Carnivores lost their prey. This impact winter may have lasted months to years, followed by longer-term climate disruptions from additional CO2 released by fires and by the impact itself. Oceans acidified somewhat as sulfur and nitrogen compounds washed out of the atmosphere in acid rain. The combined stresses triggered a mass extinction. Roughly 3/4 of species on Earth vanished. Non-avian dinosaurs disappeared entirely. Pterosaurs died out. Large marine reptiles like mosasaurs and plesiosaurs vanished. Ammonites, so abundant for so long, were wiped out. Many plankton and reef organisms suffered heavy losses, yet not everything perished. Small, adaptable animals had better chances. Birds, the surviving lineage of theropod dinosaurs, endured, perhaps subsisting on seeds, insects, or detritus. Small mammals, already living in diverse niches, likewise survived and began to diversify afterward. Crocodiles, turtles, many fish, and a variety of plants pulled through as well. In the aftermath, as dust settled and light returned, the world that emerged was profoundly different. The reign of non-avian dinosaurs was ended. Mammals, birds, and flowering plants entered a new phase of expansion in the Cenozoic. The line in the rock that marks this event The thin, global layer enriched in iridium and other impact-related materials divides the Mesozoic from the eras that followed. Below it lie the bones of Triceratops, Tyrannosaurus, and Hadrosaurs. Above it, a different cast begins to appear. Without that asteroid, it is entirely possible that dinosaurs would have remained dominant for many millions more years, and mammals might have stayed small. Our own existence as humans depends, in a real sense, on that moment of catastrophe. When we walk around today, though, it's easy to think of the Mesozoic as gone sealed away in stone and memory. But its echoes are everywhere. The most obvious are the birds. Every sparrow, crow, eagle, and pigeon is a feathered dinosaur, descended from small theropods that survived the end Cretaceous extinction. Their hollow bones, their eggs, their feathers, their respiratory system all trace back to that lineage. When a bird sings at dawn, you're hearing a far distant echo of voices that once shared the world with giant sauropods and horned ceratopsians. Plants bear the Mesozoic imprint as well. Flowering plants, which arose and spread in the Cretaceous, now dominate Earth's flora. The orchards, gardens, and fields we tend, the forests of maples and oaks, the grains that sustain us, wheat, rice, maize, all belong to lineages that either originated or flourished during that time. Conifers, cycads, ginkgos, and ferns, so prominent back then, still grow among us. In certain parks, when you walk beneath ginkgo trees, you walk among living fossils, direct descendants of forests that shaded dinosaurs. The continents themselves reflect Mesozoic events. The Atlantic Ocean opened, the Indian Plate began its journey, mountain belts formed or grew. The shapes of our coastlines and many of our climate patterns owe their existence to plate movements that took place while dinosaurs walked the Earth. Our culture is also filled with Mesozoic reflections. Dinosaurs occupy a central place in our stories, art, and films. They serve as symbols of power and of vulnerability, massive, successful creatures, undone not by competition, but by sudden change. They remind us that no matter how dominant a group becomes, external events can alter the course of life quickly. Fossils are tangible echoes. Each skeleton, footprint, or preserved leaf is a direct trace left in rock by living beings and environments long vanished. When scientists or museum visitors examine a dinosaur bone or an ammonite shell, they are literally touching remnants of that deep time. On a subtler level, the Mesozoic shapes how we think about time. Confronting intervals of tens or hundreds of millions of years stretches our perspective beyond human history. It reveals how brief our own species' existence has been, and how transient many of our current arrangements are. The Mesozoic shows us that Earth can remain warm, largely ice-free, and full of large animals for hundreds of millions of years, yet still be vulnerable to abrupt events. It reminds us that climate can change gradually or suddenly, and that ecosystems respond in complex ways. When we study ancient greenhouse climates, mass extinctions, or the rise and fall of major groups, we aren't merely satisfying curiosity about the past. We're learning about how life and planet interact, lessons that matter in our own time as we alter the atmosphere and climate at unprecedented speeds. The echoes of the Mesozoic are in every bird, every flower, each mountain silhouette, each fossil in a rock face. They're also in our awareness that we too are part of Earth's unfolding story, not separate from it. We live in the wake of that age. We walk on land whose shapes were drafted then. We share the planet with the descendants of its survivors. We study its rocks to understand how life persists, adapts, and transforms in the face of change. The Mesozoic is not just a lost age of reptiles. It is one long chapter of Earth's ongoing narrative, one that continues to influence every day we live. And so, for now, we step back from that time. If you found some calm in wandering through these ancient worlds, you're welcome to stay with us for more journeys into Earth's deep history. You might choose to like or subscribe, if that feels right, to help others find their way to this quiet corner where we explore science at an unhurried pace. For the moment, thank you for listening. May your own days and nights carry a trace of that same wonder the Mesozoic has left behind.